Hey my friend, get comfortable, because tonight we're stepping into Victorian Britain, into the private world of women who trusted a small brown bottle more completely than almost anything else in their lives. A respectable lady, admired by everyone who knew her, who came to depend on a medicine she believed was simply helping her, never once suspecting what that dependence had quietly become. A doctor, entirely well-meaning, entirely convinced of what he was doing, prescribing that very same bottle for pain, for anxiety, for sleeplessness, for a cough, or for a difficult recovery after childbirth. And somewhere in an ordinary house, on an ordinary evening, a woman noticing quietly and with a kind of dread she could not quite name, that another day had passed and she simply could not get through it without reaching for one more carefully measured dose. Tonight holds a great many more of these, folded quietly into the story of ordinary women living their ordinary lives across the second half of the 19th century. If a story like this one has ever helped you drift off, a like and a subscribe genuinely helps this small channel reach someone else out there who might need it too. It costs you nothing, and it means more than you would probably guess. Let me know in the comments below where you're watching from tonight. I really do read every single one. Alright, let your shoulders drop. Let's begin. Let us begin properly with the woman and the bottle behind the hairbrush. Her name, for tonight, is Constance Ashworth, and in the autumn of 1867 she is 36 years old, the wife of a man who sits on the board of 2 charitable institutions and 1 very profitable shipping concern, and the mother of 3 children, the eldest of whom has just been sent away to school in a manner that has left the house feeling, in her words to her sister, unbearably quiet. She lives in a tall house on a good street in a fashionable part of London, the kind of house with a housekeeper and a cook and 2 housemaids and a nursemaid for the youngest child, the kind of house where nothing is ever visibly out of place. Constance herself is, by any external measure, exactly what a woman of her position is meant to be. She receives callers with warmth and precision. She sits on the committee of a home for destitute women, a position she takes seriously and works at with real diligence. She plays the piano beautifully, better than is strictly fashionable to admit to, and she has read more of her husband's library than he has, though she's careful never to let this show at dinner parties, where it might make the other wives uncomfortable. What none of her friends know, what her own husband has only the vaguest suspicion of, is that Constance has not slept without help in almost 4 years. It began, as these things so often did, with something entirely reasonable. A difficult confinement with her 3rd child. A recovery that dragged on longer than expected. A doctor who prescribed a small bottle of laudanum for the pain, and for what he called her nerves, which had, understandably enough, been badly shaken by a birth that very nearly killed her. She took it as directed. It helped enormously. And when the prescribed course ended and the pain had genuinely faded, she found that something else had not faded with it. A restlessness in the evenings, a low hum of anxiety that the medicine had been quietly smoothing over the whole time without either of them quite realizing it. She went back to her physician. He renewed the prescription without much discussion. Why would he not? It was, in 1867, one of the most commonly prescribed medicines in the entire country, trusted by physicians of every reputation, sold openly by every chemist on every high street, present in some form in nearly every respectable household medicine chest in the land. Constance does not think of herself as a woman with a problem. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it will come up again and again tonight in one form or another. She thinks of herself, when she thinks of the bottle at all, as a woman with a delicate constitution who has found, through the good offices of a competent physician, a reliable way to manage it. Her husband knows she takes something for her nerves in the evenings. He does not ask what, and she does not tell him, not out of any particular secrecy, but because the subject has simply never seemed worth raising, in the way that one does not narrate the taking of a headache powder or a dose of salts. It is a medicine. It sits in the category of medicines. And medicines, in the world Constance inhabits, are not something a lady discusses over dinner. The amount Constance takes now is considerably more than the amount her physician originally prescribed, Not dramatically more, not in a single leap that either of them would have noticed, but gradually a few additional drops added to the spoon over the course of months and then years, because the old amount had quietly stopped being quite enough to bring the same ease it once did. She has never once thought of this as increasing her dose in any alarming sense. She thinks of it, when she thinks of it at all, as her body simply requiring slightly more than it used to, the way a person might notice they need reading glasses with a slightly stronger prescription as the years pass. Nobody in her life has ever suggested to her that there might be another explanation. Why would they? Her physician has never raised the subject either, in part because he genuinely does not think of laudanum the way we might think of it now, and in part because Constance, when she visits him, presents as precisely what she's supposed to present as a composed, articulate, entirely rational woman describing a familiar set of symptoms in the familiar language of Victorian nervous complaint. We will come back to Constance more than once tonight, because her story unfolds slowly, the way these things generally did. For now, though, I want to take you somewhere else entirely, because one of the strange and important truths about this subject is how many different doors it walked through into ordinary British life. It did not arrive only through grand society drawing rooms. It arrived through the nursery, through the workshop, through the farm cottage, through the chemist's counter on the corner of every high street in the country. And to understand why a woman like Constance could reach for that bottle without a flicker of alarm, you need to understand just how completely, how casually opium had settled into the daily texture of the era. Let me take you to a doctor's consulting room, not far from Constance's own street, on an ordinary Tuesday morning in that same year. The physician's name, for our purposes, is Dr. Alderton, a man in his 50s with a good reputation built over 3 decades of careful conventional practice. He is not a careless man, he is not indifferent to his patients, and he is not, by any fair measure, what we would now think of as a reckless prescriber. He is, in fact, entirely a product of his medical education, which taught him, with real scientific confidence for the period, that opium in its various preparations was one of the most valuable and most reliable tools available to him. It relieved pain more effectively than almost anything else in his cabinet. It calmed the nervous system in ways that seemed, to the medical understanding of the day, to be gentle and restorative rather than dangerous. It settled coughs, quieted digestive upset, eased the agitation that so often accompanied fevers, and did all of this with a consistency that made it, from where Dr. Alderton stood, something close to a wonder drug. This morning his first patient is a young married woman with a complaint that will sound strange to modern ears, attached to the treatment she's about to receive. She describes a tightness in her chest that comes on in the evenings, a racing heart when she thinks about her husband's business troubles, difficulty falling asleep, and a general sense, in her words, of being wound too tightly to function properly. Dr. Alderton listens carefully. He asks about her appetite, her digestion, whether her monthly courses are regular. He examines her pulse, which he finds slightly elevated, and within a few minutes of quiet consideration, he reaches for his prescription pad and writes out a preparation of laudanum to be taken in small measured doses as needed for her nerves. He's not thinking of this the way a modern physician would think of prescribing a powerful opioid. He's thinking of it the way you or I might think of recommending a cup of chamomile tea to a friend who cannot settle down after a stressful day, except that his version of chamomile tea happens to be a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, considerably stronger than either of them fully appreciates. This is the piece that is genuinely difficult to hold in your mind if you're hearing it for the first time. The doctors of this era were not villains hiding a dangerous secret. They were, almost without exception, working entirely within the honest limits of what medical science understood at the time, and what medical science understood at the time was that opium, used properly, was safe, effective, and remarkably versatile. It is worth pausing here on the word versatile, because it undersells the reality rather badly. There was scarcely a category of complaint in the Victorian medical vocabulary that did not, at some point, find its way to an opium-based remedy. Headaches, toothaches. The vague and enormous category of ailments doctors of the period simply called nervous complaints, which covered everything from genuine anxiety to what we would now recognise as depression, to the ordinary exhaustion of a woman managing a large household on very little sleep, coughs and colds, diarrhea, for which opium remained for decades one of the only genuinely effective treatments available, a fact that is easy to forget when we are busy being alarmed about everything else. Insomnia, obviously. The pain of childbirth and the long recovery that so often followed it. The discomfort of monthly courses, which Victorian medicine treated with a seriousness that would probably surprise you, given how dismissively women's pain is so often discussed in other corners of the historical record. And grief. We will spend real time on grief tonight, because it deserves it, and because it is one of the doors through which opium walked into more respectable households than almost anything else on this list. Before we get to grief, though, let me take you into a nursery, because this is the part of the story that tends to unsettle people most, and I think it deserves to be told gently and without judgment, because judgment is not really the point tonight. The mother's name is Margaret Whitfield. She lives some distance from Constance, in a comfortable but far less grand household, the wife of a solicitor's clerk with steady, respectable, unspectacular income. She has 2 children already, and a third on the way, and on this particular night her youngest, not yet a year old, is cutting a tooth, and has been crying for the better part of 3 hours, in a pitch that has begun to feel, to Margaret's exhausted ears, almost unbearable. She has been awake since midnight. Her husband sleeps in the next room, not from unkindness, but from the ordinary Victorian arrangement of these things, in which the care of a wakeful infant belonged, almost without exception, to the mother and whichever servant she could afford to help her, and Margaret, on a clerk's income, has only a girl of 14 who comes in during the day and goes home at night. So it is Margaret alone, pacing the small nursery in her nightgown, the baby red-faced and furious against her shoulder, when she finally goes to the shelf above the washstand and takes down a small bottle with a name printed on the label that sounds, if you say it quickly, almost like a nursery rhyme itself, Godfrey's Cordial. It is not the only such preparation available to her. There are others with names just as gentle-sounding, Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup being perhaps the most famous of them all, a name that would go on to become, decades later, a kind of historical shorthand for exactly this practice. But on this particular night it is Godfrey's Cordial that Margaret reaches for, because it is what her own mother used, and what the chemist recommended without hesitation when she first asked, and what every other mother on her street keeps in her own cupboard for exactly these long, ragged nights. She measures out a small amount, mixes it into a spoonful of sugar water the way she has been shown, and gives it to the baby. Within perhaps 20 minutes, the crying softens, then stops altogether. The baby's small body goes loose and heavy in her arms in a way that Margaret experiences in the moment as nothing more complicated than relief. Her own relief, and by extension she believes her child's. She carries him back to the crib, settles him, and finally allows herself to lie down. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to make this sound more alarming than it needs to, and it would also be dishonest to pretend it was not genuinely serious. Godfrey's Cordial, like most of the soothing syrups sold across Britain in this period, contained a meaningful quantity of opium, usually in the form of laudanum, along with treacle or sugar to make it palatable, and often a small amount of spice to give it a pleasant smell. It was sold entirely legally, entirely openly, by chemists who believed in it as thoroughly as Margaret did, marketed directly to mothers as a safe and gentle way to settle a fretful infant. Margaret does not know the precise composition of what she has just given her son. She does not know that infants metabolize such preparations far less efficiently than adults, that the margin between a dose that soothes and a dose that does real harm is considerably narrower in a small body than in a grown one. Nobody has told her this, because very few people in her world understand it themselves yet. What she knows is what everyone around her knows, which is that the cordial works, that it is trusted, that it is in the fullest sense of the word as her era understood it, ordinary. This detail, the ordinariness of it, is the thread I want you to hold on to as we move through the rest of tonight's story. It will come up again and again, in different rooms, in different circumstances, wearing different names, and it is worth saying plainly, once, before we move on, that the practice of dosing restless or teething infants with opium-based syrups was common enough across Britain in this period that public health officials would eventually take real notice of it, though that recognition and the slow changes that came with it belonged mostly to the later decades of the century, well beyond the night we are watching Margaret live through right now. Let us step outside the nursery and the drawing room for a moment and go somewhere more public, because I think it will help the whole picture make more sense. Picture an ordinary high street in an ordinary market town, somewhere in the English Midlands, on a bright Tuesday morning. There is a chemist's shop on the corner, the kind with a bow-fronted window and a row of large glass jars filled with coloured liquids, purely decorative by this point, but still carrying the visual memory of an older apothecary tradition. Inside, behind the counter, stands a man we will call Mr. Sedgwick, a chemist and druggist in his early 40s, who has run this particular shop for going on 15 years, and inherited the trade from his own father before him. Mr. Sedgwick's shop sells almost everything a household might need in the way of remedies, and a good portion of what he sells, in one preparation or another, contains opium. There is laudanum, sold by the ounce, which any adult customer can purchase without a prescription for most of the period we are discussing tonight, though the details of exactly what could be sold to whom, and under what conditions, shifted gradually as the decades passed, and as Parliament slowly, unevenly, began paying closer attention to the trade. There are the soothing syrups for children, several competing brands lined up on the same shelf. There are cough mixtures, throat lozenges, and a preparation called Dover's powder, a mixture of opium and ipecacuanha that half the households in England kept on hand for colds and fevers. There is a tonic marketed specifically to women, promising relief from what the label calls female weakness and nervous exhaustion, and if you were to have the contents analysed, which almost nobody at the time thought to do, you would find opium there too, in a concentration the label makes no particular effort to disclose. He sells all of this without a flicker of concern, because he, like Dr. Alderton across town, has been trained within a system that regards these substances as safe, useful, and entirely respectable articles of commerce. He knows his customers by name. He knows that the woman who comes in every fortnight for a fresh bottle of laudanum is not, in his understanding, doing anything remotely unusual. She is simply restocking a household necessity, the way she might restock candles or soap. He has no particular framework for recognizing dependence, even when it is standing directly in front of him at his own counter, because the very concept, in the modern clinical sense we now take for granted, has not yet fully crystallized in the medical thinking of his era. There were physicians and reformers who were beginning, even by the 1860s and 70s, to raise real and serious concerns about opium's dangers, and we will meet some of that growing awareness later tonight. But for the ordinary chemist behind an ordinary counter in an ordinary town, the daily transaction of selling laudanum to a respectable customer carried no more weight than selling a bar of soap or a tin of tooth powder. What Mr. Sedgwick does understand, better than almost anyone else in this story, is his customers' habits, because habits are, after all, the foundation of a successful shop. He could tell you, if you asked him, which households buy their laudanum weekly and which buy it monthly. He could tell you which families favour Godfrey's cordial and which prefer Mrs. Winslow's. He could tell you, though he has never once framed it this way to himself, which of his regular customers has, over the years, moved from buying a small bottle every few weeks to buying a somewhat larger one somewhat more often. He simply does not think of this as anything other than the ordinary variation of household need, the kind of thing that shifts with the seasons, with illness in the family, with the ordinary rhythms of life. Advertising played its own quiet part in all of this, and it is worth spending a moment here, because the marketing of the period tells you almost everything about how completely respectable this substance had become. The advertisements for these patent medicines, which appeared in newspapers and magazines read by exactly the sort of households Constance and Margaret belonged to, spoke the gentle, reassuring language of domestic comfort rather than anything resembling a warning. They promised peaceful sleep for restless children. They promised relief for the overworked nerves of busy mothers and hard-working men. They used soft illustrations of sleeping infants and content, rosy-cheeked families gathered by the fire. There was nothing in the tone of this advertising to suggest danger, because the companies selling these remedies did not, for the most part, believe there was any particular danger to warn against. They were selling comfort, plainly and sincerely, to a public that wanted exactly that. And so the small brown bottle travelled everywhere. It travelled into the nursery, as we have seen with Margaret. It travelled into the drawing room, where it sat, as I mentioned earlier, on a side table between a scent bottle and a family photograph, treated with precisely the same unremarkable respect as either of those objects. Let me take you into that drawing room properly now, because I think it will round out the picture nicely before we slow things down and go deeper into a few of these lives. The house belongs to a family we might call the Prices, in a comfortable square not far from Regent's Park. And on this particular afternoon, Mrs. Catherine Price is receiving callers, as she does most Thursdays between 3 and 5, the appointed hour for exactly this kind of social visit. The room is warm, a little too warm by modern standards. The fire built up generously because a cold drawing room reflects poorly on a hostess. There is a tea service laid out on a low table, and beside it, on the small side table nearer the window, the arrangement I described a moment ago, a crystal scent bottle, a framed photograph of Mr. Price in the uniform he wore during his years of colonial service, and a small brown bottle of laudanum, entirely unremarked upon by anyone in the room. Catherine is 52 years old this year, and she has been taking some form of opium preparation, in varying amounts, for close to 15 years, beginning not long after what her physician delicately referred to as the change of life arrived earlier and more severely than expected. The heat that rises through her without warning, the nights when sleep simply refuses to come, the low grinding headaches that used to arrive perhaps once a season and now arrive most weeks, all of it has, over the years, been managed with small careful doses from that same brown bottle, prescribed originally by a physician who has since retired and replaced, without much ceremony, by a younger man who simply continued the arrangement he inherited along with her file. Her guest this afternoon is a Mrs. Latimer, a woman of similar age and similar circumstance, and their conversation moves easily between the ordinary subjects of the day, a mutual acquaintance daughter who has just become engaged, the price of coal this winter, a sermon last Sunday that ran rather longer than anyone would have liked. At one point Mrs. Latimer mentions, entirely in passing, that she has been sleeping poorly herself lately, and Catherine, without any particular weight in her voice, suggests that a small dose of something might help, and offers, almost as an afterthought, the name of her own physician, a thoroughly respectable recommendation between two thoroughly respectable women. Neither of them experiences this exchange as anything remarkable. It is simply one friend recommending a trusted remedy to another, the social equivalent of suggesting a good dressmaker or a reliable coachman. I find something genuinely striking in this scene, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before we move on. There is no shame in that room. There is no hushed voice, no lowered eyes, none of the coded language people sometimes imagine must have surrounded a subject like this even in its own era. The small brown bottle sits in full view because it has nothing to hide from. It belongs to the same category of object as the tea things and the photograph frame, entirely folded into the visible ordinary furniture of a respectable life. That, more than anything else, is the detail I most want you to carry with you tonight. Not that these women were secretly troubled beneath a veneer of Victorian propriety, though some of them, as we will see, genuinely were, but that the substance itself carried no social weight at all. It was not whispered about, it was recommended over tea. Now let me take you to one more room before we slow the pace of this evening down properly, because there is a fifth door through which opium walked into respectable British life that I think deserves its own moment, and that door is grief. Eleanor Hartley is 29 years old, and 11 weeks ago she buried her husband, a naval officer who died not in any battle but of a fever contracted somewhere off the coast of West Africa, the kind of death that arrived by letter rather than by any warning, a single sheet of paper that ended one version of her life and began another she had never once rehearsed in her imagination, She wears black, as convention demands, and will continue to wear it in various depths of mourning for a period of time that etiquette manuals of the era set out in almost mathematical detail, moving from deepest crepe to the gradual, permitted lightening of half mourning over the course of roughly 2 years, though Eleanor, in the weeks right after the letter arrived, could not have told you what month it was, let alone how many more lay ahead of her in this particular uniform of sorrow. Her physician calls twice in the first fortnight, not because anything is physically wrong with her in the way a broken bone or a fever would be wrong, but because grief of this intensity was, in Victorian medical thinking, entirely within the domain of legitimate medical concern. He finds her pale, sleepless, prone to sudden weeping that arrives without warning and passes just as suddenly, unable to eat more than a few mouthfuls at a sitting. He prescribes laudanum, a modest dose to be taken at night to secure sleep, and a smaller dose that she may take during the day if the weeping becomes, in his careful phrase, too much to bear with dignity in front of the children. That last detail matters more than it might seem to at first. Eleanor has 2 young children, a boy of 6 and a girl of 4, and the expectation placed on a Victorian widow, even one drowning in genuine and enormous grief, was that she would continue to manage her household, oversee her children's upbringing, and maintain the outward composure that her position required, all while carrying a loss that would, in any honest accounting, have flattened almost anyone. The laudanum, in this context, functions as something close to what we might now call an emotional regulator, a way of keeping the machinery of daily life running even while the woman operating it is, underneath the black crepe and the carefully managed expression, in genuine and profound pain. She takes her evening dose without any sense that she is doing anything other than what any sensible grieving woman in her position would do. Her sister, who calls often in these early months, notices that Eleanor seems calmer than she expected, more composed, more able to sit through a visit without dissolving entirely, and privately credits this to Eleanor's naturally strong character rather than to the small bottle on the mantel that neither of them ever directly discusses. This is worth noting too. Nobody in Eleanor's circle experiences her use of laudanum as anything requiring comment, because grief itself in this era was understood as something that required medical management, and opium was simply the tool available for managing it. We will return to Eleanor later in the evening, because her story, like Constance's, does not end in these first weeks, and there is more of it worth telling. For now, though, I want to slow things down. We have moved quickly through several rooms tonight: a dressing table, a physician's consulting room, a nursery, a chemist's shop, a drawing room, a house in mourning, and I think that quickness has served us well, because it lets you feel, all at once, just how many doors this substance walked through, how completely it had settled into the ordinary architecture of Victorian domestic life. But now I want to stay in one place for a while, and go deeper, and let the details breathe the way they deserve to. Let me tell you properly and slowly what laudanum actually was, because I think it helps to understand the substance itself before we go any further into the lives it touched. Laudanum, at its simplest, was a tincture of opium, meaning raw opium dissolved in alcohol, usually a considerable quantity of alcohol, sometimes flavoured with cinnamon or saffron to soften the bitterness and give it a warm, almost spiced smell that people of the period occasionally described as not unpleasant. The recipe itself traced back centuries, well before the Victorian era, to physicians working in the 16th and 17th centuries who had discovered, through trial and long observation, that opium dissolved far more readily and far more usefully in alcohol than it did in water alone. By the time Constance and Eleanor and Margaret were reaching for their own bottles, the formula had been refined and standardized to a degree, though even then the actual strength of a given bottle could vary meaningfully depending on which chemist prepared it and which batch of raw opium had gone into the mixture. The opium itself came from poppies, the same plant that produces the seeds you might find on a loaf of bread today, though a particular variety cultivated specifically for its sap. The raw sap was harvested by hand, scored from the seed pods, and collected as it oozed out and dried into a dark, sticky resin, a process that had been carried out for thousands of years across various parts of the world, and which by the 19th century was being conducted on an industrial scale. much of it in territories under British colonial control in South Asia, and shipped in enormous quantities back to Britain and onward to markets across the globe, including in one of the era's more uncomfortable historical footnotes, forced sale into China, a trade so significant to British commercial interests that Britain fought 2 wars in the 1840s and again in the 1850s, substantially over the right to continue selling it there. That is a much larger and much darker story than we have time for fully tonight, though I think it deserves at least this acknowledgement, because the opium sitting in Constance's dressing table drawer and the opium that fueled a global trade empire were in the most literal sense the very same substance, moving through very different channels toward very different ends. Within Britain itself, the substance arrived by the middle of the century almost entirely unregulated. Anyone with a few pence could walk into a chemist's shop and purchase laudanum, or raw opium itself for that matter, with no prescription required, no record kept, no questions asked beyond the ordinary courtesies of a shop transaction. It was, by weight, remarkably cheap, cheaper in fact than beer in many parts of the country, which meant that opium use in Britain during this period was never confined only to the wealthy households we have been visiting tonight. Working families in industrial towns, particularly in the fen districts of eastern England, where damp conditions produced a great deal of what was called ague, a recurring fever we would now likely recognise as a form of malaria, relied on opium just as heavily, if not more so, than the fashionable households of London, though their story tends to be told less often, perhaps because it lacks the particular poignancy that attaches itself to the image of a respectable lady with a secret. The first meaningful attempt to regulate any of this did not arrive until 1868, with the Pharmacy Act, which required that certain poisons, opium among them, be sold only by registered pharmacists and recorded in a poison book kept for exactly this purpose. It was a modest step, and it did little to slow the overall consumption of the substance across the country, but it marked in its quiet bureaucratic way the very beginning of an official recognition that something about this arrangement might eventually need closer attention. Constance, taking her nightly dose in that same year the Act passed, would have felt none of this shift in her own daily life. Her physician continued to prescribe, her chemist continued to sell. The bottle continued to sit behind the hairbrush, entirely unaffected by the slow turning of parliamentary wheels many miles away. I want to take you through an ordinary day in Constance's house now, slowly, because I think the texture of it tells you more than any list of facts could. She wakes at 7, the way she always does, to the sound of her housemaid drawing back the curtains and setting down a small tray with tea and 2 thin biscuits on the table beside her bed. The room smells faintly of coal smoke from the fire that was lit an hour earlier to take the chill off before she rises. And beneath that, more faintly still, the rosewater she dabs behind her ears each night before sleep. She does not take her morning dose the moment she wakes. That habit came later, and we will get to it. In this particular autumn, the morning dose comes after breakfast, after she has read through her correspondence and made her notes for the day in the small leather book she keeps for exactly that purpose. 3 calls to make, a meeting of the committee for the Home for Destitute Women at 11, a fitting with her dressmaker in the early afternoon. The dose itself is a small ritual, performed with a kind of unthinking precision that comes only from years of repetition. She goes to the dressing table, opens the drawer, moves the hairbrush aside, and takes out the brown bottle along with a small silver spoon kept beside it. She measures the amount with a steadiness of hand that would surprise anyone who imagined a Victorian lady as delicate or fluttering, because there is nothing delicate about this particular action. It is practiced, it is exact. She swallows it quickly, the taste bitter beneath the sweetness the chemist has added, and within 20 minutes or so, the low hum of anxiety that has been sitting at the base of her chest since she woke begins, gradually, to ease. This is the part I think is genuinely important to understand, and I do not want to rush past it. The relief Constance feels in this moment is entirely real. It is not imagined, and it is not merely the placebo comfort of ritual, though ritual plays its part too. Opium does, in fact, produce a real physiological calming effect, a real easing of anxious, racing thought, a real softening of physical tension. This is precisely why the substance became so trusted, so quickly, by so many people across so many different circumstances. It worked. That is the uncomfortable, complicated truth sitting underneath this entire story. It was not a false promise sold by cynical men to gullible women. It was a genuinely effective substance that happened to carry a cost few people in this era had the framework to recognize or measure. By the time Constance's morning dose has taken its full effect, she is already dressed and downstairs, moving through her day with a particular composure that everyone around her has come to expect, and that she herself has come to depend on entirely, though she would never use that particular word for it. The chairwoman of the Destitute Women's Committee remarks, that same morning, on how remarkably even-tempered Constance always seems, how steady she is in meetings where other women grow flustered or short with each other over small disagreements. Constance accepts the compliment graciously and does not think, even for a moment, to connect her steadiness to the bottle behind the hairbrush. Why would she? In her own understanding of herself, she has simply always been this way, calm, capable, unflappable, and the medicine is merely helping her return to her natural state after a difficult period some years ago, rather than creating a state that did not previously exist. I think this is one of the truest and saddest parts of the whole picture, if I am honest with you. The line between medicine and dependence, in Constance's mind, simply does not exist, because nobody around her has ever drawn it for her. There is no diagnostic category in her physician's understanding that would let him look at her steadily increasing use and recognize it for what it has quietly become. There is no public conversation, no cautionary pamphlet passed between friends, no whispered warning from an older relative who learned the hard way. The entire structure of knowledge that might have allowed Constance to see her own situation clearly simply had not yet been built. She is not hiding anything from herself in the way we might imagine a person in denial today, carefully avoiding an uncomfortable truth they secretly suspect. She genuinely does not have access to the truth in the first place, because the culture around her has not yet articulated it. Let me widen the lens again for a moment, because I promised you variety tonight, and there are several more rooms worth visiting before we settle in for the long, slow remainder of the evening. Let us go to a bedroom in a different house entirely, several years earlier in Constance's own life, back to the confinement that first brought laudanum into her world, because childbirth and its long, often difficult recovery formed one of the single largest doorways through which respectable Victorian women encountered opium for the first time. Childbirth in this period was, by any modern measure, a genuinely dangerous undertaking, carrying real and substantial risk of death for the mother, the child, or both, a risk that fell across every social class, though it fell hardest, as these things generally did, on the poor, who could not afford the attendance of a physician and relied instead on local midwives whose skill varied enormously from parish to parish. Constance, when her third child was born, had the benefit of both a trusted midwife and a physician on call, and even so, the birth itself was long and difficult, the kind that leaves a woman genuinely weakened for weeks afterward, prone to bleeding, to fever, to the particular exhaustion that comes from a body that has been through something enormous and has not yet finished recovering from it. Laudanum, in this context, served several purposes that a modern reader might not immediately think to connect. It eased the pain of the birth itself, though its use during labour was more limited and more carefully calculated than its use afterward, since a physician attending a birth needed his patient conscious and cooperative rather than deeply sedated. It was in the weeks following the birth that the medicine became most central, easing the physical pain of recovery, calming what Constance's physician diagnosed as a nervous excitability common to new mothers, and helping her sleep despite the demands of a newborn who required feeding through the night. This particular use, laudanum given to new mothers recovering from difficult births, was so common across every level of society that it would have seemed strange, even neglectful, for a physician not to offer it. There is a young woman I want to introduce to you now, someone considerably younger than Constance or Catherine or Eleanor, because I think her story fills in a piece of the picture the others cannot quite reach. Her name is Sophia Bell, and in the spring of 1874 she is 22 years old, unmarried, living at home with her parents in a comfortable house in Bath, the kind of young woman whose days are structured around the particular rhythms expected of an unmarried gentlewoman waiting, in the polite language of the era, to be settled. She paints reasonably well, she reads a great deal, more novels than her mother entirely approves of, and once a month, with a regularity that has shaped the architecture of her adult life since she was 15. She suffers from pain severe enough to keep her in bed for the better part of 2 days. Nobody in Sophia's household treats this as anything unusual, because it is not unusual, though the medical understanding of what precisely causes such pain remained, in this period, genuinely limited and often shot through with theories that a modern reader would find strange or even faintly troubling. Ideas about women's reproductive organs as inherently delicate, prone to a kind of systemic weakness that touched everything from her digestion to her temperament. What Sophia's mother does understand, from long practical experience raising 3 daughters through their own versions of this same monthly ordeal, is that a small dose of laudanum, taken at the first sign of pain, makes the difference between a day spent curled miserably in bed and a day spent merely resting quietly with a book. She keeps a bottle in the linen cupboard for exactly this purpose, doled out to whichever daughter needs it that month, with no more ceremony than she would use dispensing a headache powder. Sophia has grown up watching her mother reach for that bottle on her own difficult days, has watched her elder sisters do the same before their marriages took them to other households, with their own versions of the same cupboard, and by the time she is old enough to manage her own dose without her mother's supervision, she does so with complete, unquestioning confidence in its safety. It has never once occurred to her to wonder whether taking it, month after month, year after year, might be building something in her body that will one day be harder to set down than it was to pick up. Why would it occur to her? Every woman she knows does the same thing. It is simply what one does, the way one takes willow bark for a headache or peppermint water for an upset stomach, an unremarkable tool in an unremarkable domestic kit. I want to pause on Sophia for just a moment longer, because there is a detail about her particular situation that I think is worth noticing without dwelling on too heavily. Unlike Constance, whose use began with a specific medical crisis and gradually expanded outward from there, Sophia's use began in adolescence, before her body had finished its own growth, and has continued in a steady monthly rhythm for going on 7 years by the time we meet her. The question of what this means for a young woman's long-term relationship with the substance, whether beginning so early changes the shape of dependence that follows, is one that Victorian medicine had essentially no framework for asking, let alone answering. It is a question in truth that would take considerably longer than the remainder of the 19th century for medical science to properly address. Let me bring you back to Constance's house for a while, because there is a figure in her household we have not yet properly met, and her role in this story matters more than you might expect. Her name is Hannah, and she has served as Constance's lady's maid for going on 6 years, a young woman of considerable competence who manages everything from Constance's wardrobe to the small daily errands that keep a lady's private life running smoothly. Among Hannah's regular duties, quiet and unremarked upon, is the preparation of Constance's evening dose, measured out and left on the dressing table each night before Constance retires, the bottle itself kept, along with a small store of household remedies, in a locked cabinet in the still room downstairs, to which Hannah holds one of only 2 keys. This detail, the locked cabinet and the servant with the key, tells you something important about how thoroughly domestic medicine had become woven into the ordinary machinery of a well-run household. The still room, a small chamber found in larger Victorian homes, and used for exactly this kind of domestic production, storage and management, held not only laudanum but a whole cabinet of remedies, camphor, quinine, sal volatile for fainting spells, various tinctures and powders that a housekeeper or senior maid like Hannah would have been expected to know intimately, dosing them out as needed with a confidence built on years of practical household training rather than any formal medical education. Hannah did not question the amounts she measured for Constance any more than she would have questioned the amount of starch used on a collar. It was simply part of her work, precise, routine, entirely without drama. What Hannah does notice, though she would never think to remark on it to anyone, not even to the cook with whom she shares most of her opinions about the household, is that the amount she measures out each evening has grown gradually over the years she has served Constance. She could not tell you exactly when the change happened, because it happened the way most gradual things happen, in increments too small to notice from week to week, and only visible if you happen to compare the present moment against a memory from several years back. Hannah has that memory, though she has never once thought to draw a conclusion from it. She simply measures what she is asked to measure, night after night, the way any good servant measures whatever her mistress requires of her. I want to bring Dr. Alderton back into the story now too, because there is a part of his working life we have not yet properly explored, and it matters a great deal to understanding why so few physicians of this era caught what we, looking back from the comfort of considerably more medical knowledge, can see so clearly. A significant portion of Dr. Alderton's practice consists of house calls, the ordinary mechanism through which respectable families received medical attention in an era when visiting a doctor's public consulting room, particularly for a delicate or private complaint, carried its own social discomfort. He visits Constance House perhaps 4 times a year now, not for any acute illness but for what has become, over the years, a kind of ongoing management of her general health and nerves, a relationship built more on familiarity and trust than on any rigorous ongoing examination. These visits follow a familiar, almost ceremonial pattern. He is shown into the morning room, offered tea, and spends perhaps 20 minutes in conversation with Constance about her general state, her sleep, her appetite, whether the children have kept her occupied or worn her down this particular season. He takes her pulse, as he always does, and finds it, as he generally does, within an acceptable range, perhaps slightly elevated but nothing alarming. He asks whether her medicine continues to serve her well, and she assures him that it does, and he renews her prescription with the same unhurried confidence he has shown for years, because nothing in this pattern has ever presented itself to him as a problem requiring intervention. He is not being careless. He is operating entirely within the honest boundaries of what his training and his era's medical understanding equipped him to recognize. Let me return to Catherine Price for a while now, because her story reaches furthest back in time of anyone we have met tonight, and it shows us something the younger women's stories cannot quite show, which is what this arrangement looked like after 15 years rather than 4 or 5. Catherine's chronic headaches, which began in earnest around the time of her change of life, have never fully resolved, though they have become, over the years, something she manages rather than something she suffers through, in much the same way a person today might manage a long-standing condition with a daily medication they no longer think of as anything remarkable. She takes a dose most mornings now, not only in the evenings as she once did, a small addition to her routine that arrived so gradually she genuinely could not tell you which particular year it started. Her physician, the younger man who inherited her case from his predecessor, sees her twice a year for what has become a kind of routine maintenance visit rather than any active treatment of a specific complaint. He has never known Catherine as anything other than a woman who takes laudanum regularly, has no memory of a version of her that did not, and so has no particular baseline against which to measure whether her current use represents an escalation or simply a stable continuation of a long-established pattern. This is worth sitting with because it points to something genuinely structural about why dependence of this kind went so long unrecognized across an entire society. The physicians who might have noticed a change over time were so often not the same physicians who had known the patient from the beginning. Practices changed hands. Patients moved between doctors as families relocated or as an aging physician retired and handed his patient list to a younger colleague. Each new doctor met each patient at a single point in time, with no fuller picture of the years stretching out behind that moment, and so the gradual upward drift of a woman's daily dose, the kind of drift that might have alarmed a physician who had watched it happen year by year, simply never presented itself as a pattern to anyone positioned to notice it. Catherine herself experiences her daily dose the way you might experience your own morning cup of tea, an established, comfortable, entirely unremarkable part of how her day begins. She does not think of herself as unable to function without it, because the question has simply never arisen. There has been no day in 15 years in which she went without it long enough to discover what that absence might feel like. This is, I think, one of the more quietly devastating aspects of this entire story, the way dependence can settle so completely into the architecture of a life that the very concept of testing it, of finding out what would happen without it, never even occurs to the person living inside it. It is not suppressed, it is not avoided, it simply never becomes a question in the first place, because nothing in Catherine's world has ever suggested to her that it should be one. I think it is worth explaining, gently and without alarm, what was actually happening inside these women's bodies over the months and years we have been describing, because understanding the mechanism helps make sense of why none of them, and very few of the physicians treating them, recognized what was unfolding. Opium, taken regularly over time, produces what we would now call tolerance, a state in which the body gradually adjusts to the substance's presence and requires a somewhat larger amount to produce the same effect it once produced at a smaller dose. This is not a moral failing or a sign of weak character, whatever the moralizing pamphlets of later decades would eventually suggest. It is simply a physiological reality, the same mechanism in principle that causes a person who drinks coffee daily to eventually need more than a single cup to feel its familiar lift. Alongside tolerance runs a second process, a gradual adaptation of the body's own nervous system to the steady presence of the substance, such that stopping abruptly produces a rebound of exactly the symptoms the medicine was originally meant to relieve, and often considerably worse ones besides: restlessness, physical discomfort, a return of anxiety magnified well beyond its original intensity. None of the women in our story tonight has ever tested this rebound directly, because none of them has ever had reason to stop taking their medicine long enough to encounter it. And this, I think, is precisely why the whole arrangement persisted so smoothly, so invisibly, for so long across so much of respectable British society. A woman who takes her dose every day, gradually increasing it in tiny increments over years, never experiences the withdrawal that might have signalled to her, or to anyone around her, that something had shifted from medicine into dependence. The warning sign that we would now recognize immediately simply never had occasion to appear, because nobody was stopping. Let me slow down even further now and take you through the ordinary texture of a Victorian afternoon, because I think there is real comfort in these details, and comfort is, after all, a good part of what we are here for tonight. It is 4 o'clock, and across thousands of drawing rooms in Britain, the ritual of afternoon tea is unfolding in more or less the same gentle rhythm, a rhythm that had by the 1870s become one of the great social institutions of the age. The custom itself is said to trace back to a duchess who found the long gap between luncheon and a fashionably late dinner left her, in her own words, with a sinking feeling around 4 in the afternoon, and who began requesting a small tray of tea and bread and butter to see her through, a habit that spread outward through fashionable society, until it became, within a generation, an entirely established institution, complete with its own elaborate etiquette. For a woman like Constance, afternoon tea is not merely refreshment, but a genuine social performance, one of the primary stages on which a lady's competence and standing are quietly, continuously assessed. The tea itself must be of good quality, properly brewed, served at the correct temperature, in the correct china, poured by the hostess herself with a steadiness of hand that suggests complete composure even on a difficult day. There are thin sandwiches, cucumber most commonly, the bread cut so fine it seems almost translucent, and a selection of small cakes that the cook has spent the better part of the morning preparing. Conversation moves along established, comfortable lines, the weather, mutual acquaintances, the latest novel making its way through polite circles, always careful to avoid anything that might tip into genuine controversy or discomfort. It is worth noticing how much quiet labour sits beneath this apparently effortless ritual, and how neatly a small dose of laudanum, taken an hour or so before callers were expected, could smooth the edges of a day that might otherwise have felt overwhelming to manage. Constance's own mother, a generation earlier, would have relied more heavily on sal volatile, a preparation of ammonia carried in a small vinaigrette bottle and inhaled at the first sign of faintness, a remedy considered entirely proper for a lady overcome by the exertions of social life. Laudanum served a related but somewhat broader purpose, not simply reviving a lady who had grown faint but steadying her nerves before the exertion even began, smoothing the low hum of anxiety that so often accompanied the endless small performances of a well-managed social life. This points to something larger, worth naming plainly, which is the sheer scale of what was expected of a woman in Constance's position, day after day, for years on end, with almost no acknowledged outlet for genuine rest or genuine complaint. The Victorian ideal of womanhood asked for endless composure, endless management, endless performance of contentment, regardless of what a woman might actually be feeling underneath it. And it is not difficult, looking back with the benefit of considerably more honest language around emotional exhaustion, to understand why a substance that reliably delivered calm, reliably smoothed anxiety, reliably allowed a tired woman to present as serene and capable, found such fertile ground in households exactly like this one. The medicine cabinet itself, whether it lived in a locked still room like Constance's or a simple cupboard shelf like Sophia's mother's, tended to hold a whole family of related remedies that tell their own story about the era's approach to health. Cough mixtures for the winter months, many containing opium in smaller doses alongside honey and lemon, general tonics, sold under names that promised vigor and restored vitality, often containing not only opium but a meaningful dose of alcohol besides, marketed to men and women alike as a kind of all-purpose restorative for the fatigue of modern life. Teething powders and soothing syrups for the children, as we have already seen with Margaret, sleeping draughts for the household's older members. It was, taken all together, a domestic pharmacy built almost entirely around a single family of substances, opium in its many forms, sitting alongside the alcohol that so often carried it, both trusted, both respectable, both entirely unremarkable in the eyes of the families who kept them close at hand. Let us move forward a little in time now, into the 1880s, because the picture I have been building for you tonight was not in fact entirely static across the whole of the Victorian period. Slowly, unevenly, in ways that took decades to gather any real momentum, a different kind of awareness had begun to form at the edges of British medical and public life, and I think it deserves its place in tonight's story, because it shows you that even within the world we have been visiting, some people were beginning to see what most could not. A handful of physicians, writing in medical journals read mostly by their own colleagues, had begun documenting cases that troubled them, patients who seemed unable to reduce their laudanum use even when the original complaint that prompted it had long since resolved, patients who grew agitated and physically unwell when a dose was delayed, patients whose lives seemed to organize themselves in ways their doctors found genuinely puzzling around the timing and availability of their medicine. These early observations did not yet carry the clinical vocabulary we would use today. The word addiction existed, but it was applied inconsistently, sometimes to describe exactly what we would now recognize under that name, sometimes used more loosely to describe simple habitual use without any particular alarm attached to it. The concept of physical dependence as a distinct medical phenomenon, separate from mere habit or weak character, was still being worked out, argued over, published and disputed in the pages of journals that most ordinary households, Constance's included, would never once encounter. There is a particular kind of case that began appearing more frequently in these medical accounts as the decades wore on, and I want to tell you about a woman who represents it, someone we might call Mrs. Eleanor Radcliffe, no relation to our earlier Eleanor, a woman in her 40s whose family finally did begin to notice, in the mid-1880s, that something about her relationship with her medicine had shifted into something else entirely. It began with small things her husband could not quite name at first, a certain glassy quality to her expression some mornings, an irritability that flared when her usual hour for taking her dose was delayed by some interruption in the household routine, a growing reluctance to travel anywhere that might separate her, even briefly, from the bottle she kept in her travelling case. Her husband, to his credit, did eventually raise the subject with her physician, not in anger, but in genuine careful concern, describing what he had observed as delicately as he could manage. The physician's response tells you a great deal about where medical understanding stood at this point in the century. He acknowledged that reducing her dose might be wise, suggested a gradual tapering over several weeks rather than any abrupt stop, and cautioned the husband, quite correctly for what was understood at the time, that stopping too suddenly could produce a genuinely unpleasant reaction in her nerves and constitution. This was, by the standards of the 1880s, a reasonably enlightened response, though it still fell considerably short of what we would now recognize as proper medical care for dependents. There was no discussion of the psychological dimension of what Mrs. Radcliffe was experiencing no framework for understanding why simply reducing the physical dose might not address everything that had grown up around her daily ritual over the years she had practiced it. I want to be careful here, because I do not want to turn Mrs. Radcliffe into a cautionary tale designed to frighten you before bed, and that is genuinely not the purpose of telling you about her. Her story matters because it shows the slow, halting beginning of recognition, the first small cracks in a wall of medical and social confidence that had, for decades, simply assumed this substance carried no serious risk for a respectable, moderate user. It would take considerably longer, well into the early decades of the 20th century and beyond, for that recognition to fully mature into the regulatory and medical frameworks we would recognize today, frameworks that eventually classified opium and its derivatives as substances requiring careful control, rather than substances that any respectable chemist could sell freely over his own counter. Let me bring you back to Margaret Whitfield for a while now, because I think her story, followed forward a few years, shows something the others cannot quite reach on their own, which is what this whole arrangement looked like from the perspective of a child growing up inside it. Margaret's eldest daughter, a girl named Alice, is by the early 1880s a young woman of 17, old enough to remember, in a hazy childhood way, the sound of her mother measuring drops into a spoon on difficult nights, old enough to have grown up entirely accustomed to the small brown bottles that lived in every household she ever visited, her own home, her grandmother's, the homes of family friends. To Alice, these bottles carry no more weight or mystery than a bottle of ink or a tin of tea. They are simply part of what a household contains. When Alice herself begins to suffer, in her middle teenage years, from the kind of monthly pain that Sophia Bell experienced in the previous chapter of our evening, her mother reaches for exactly the remedy her own mother reached for, and Alice takes it without a moment's hesitation, because she has watched this exact transaction happen in her own home for as long as she can remember. There is something quietly remarkable in this continuity, a substance passing not merely from chemist to customer, but from mother to daughter across generations, each new generation inheriting not only the remedy itself, but the complete unquestioned confidence in its safety that made the whole arrangement possible in the first place. Nobody along this chain of inheritance is doing anything reckless by the standards of their own understanding. Each woman is simply doing what the woman before her did, trusting what she was taught to trust, passing along what she believes, sincerely and reasonably, to be a genuine kindness. I think it is worth pausing here to say something plainly, because I do not want tonight's story to leave you with an impression that is more frightening than the historical reality actually supports. The overwhelming majority of Victorian women who used laudanum, Godfrey's cordial, or any of the other opium-based remedies we have discussed tonight lived out their entire lives without the kind of visible crisis that later reformers would eventually use to argue for tighter regulation. Many of them, Constance and Catherine and Sophia among them in our own telling, continued their moderate, steady use for years or decades, experiencing real relief from real complaints, never once encountering the more dramatic consequences that occasionally appeared in the medical literature or the occasional newspaper account of a household tragedy. Dependence, in the clinical sense we would recognize today, existed on this same substance for all of them in some form, but dependence did not necessarily mean visible ruin. For most of these women, it meant simply a life lived slightly differently than it might otherwise have been, a life organized quietly around the presence of a small bottle, a life in which a particular kind of composure was purchased at a cost that nobody around them, including the women themselves, ever fully totaled up. This is, I think, the genuinely strange and worth sitting with fact at the center of tonight's whole story. A whole society built a version of respectable, comfortable, functional domestic life on top of a substance we now understand to be genuinely addictive, and for the most part, that society simply continued functioning. Households ran, children were raised, committees met, and charitable work was accomplished, and dinner parties were hosted, and pianos were played beautifully in quiet drawing rooms every evening, all of it resting, in more households than history tends to acknowledge, on a small brown bottle that nobody around it thought twice about. I want to return to Eleanor Hartley now, the young widow we left in the early weeks of her mourning, because enough time has passed in her story to show us something worth seeing. It is now 3 years since her husband's death, and Eleanor has, by most measures available to her world, managed her grief with real dignity. She has moved through the prescribed stages of mourning dress, from the heavy crepe of the first year to the lighter, more silvered fabrics permitted in the second, and now, in the third year, she wears colours again, though quieter ones than she once favoured, a habit of restraint that seems to have settled into her more generally, rather than lifting away along with the black dresses. She still takes laudanum most nights, a habit that began, as we saw, in the earliest and most acute weeks of her grief, and simply never stopped. The way a shape pressed into soft ground does not spring back merely because the weight that made it has been lifted. Her physician, on his occasional visits, no longer asks pointed questions about her state of mind, because she presents, and genuinely feels herself to be, considerably recovered from the depths of those first months. The medicine has, in a sense, become detached from its original purpose. It no longer treats an acute crisis of grief so much as it simply maintains a baseline of calm that Eleanor has come to consider her natural resting state, much the way Constance came to think of her own composure as an inherent quality rather than a chemically assisted one. Eleanor has remarried by this point to a widower with children of his own from his first marriage, a sensible, companionable match arranged with the practical good sense that so often governed second marriages of this era. Her new husband knows she takes something for her nerves in the evenings, in the same vague, unquestioning way Constance's husband knows the same thing about his own wife, and it has never once occurred to him to ask further, because there is nothing in her behaviour, her composure, her capable management of a now considerably larger household, to suggest that any question is warranted. She is, by every visible measure, a woman who has weathered genuine tragedy and emerged from it steady, capable and well. I find myself genuinely moved by Eleanor's story every time I sit with it, because I think it captures something true about grief itself that has very little to do with the specific substance involved. Grief does not always resolve cleanly, it does not always announce its own ending. Sometimes it simply gets managed, folded into the ordinary architecture of a life that continues moving forward regardless, and the tools we use to manage it, whatever they happen to be in whatever era we are living through, become quietly permanent fixtures of who we understand ourselves to be. Eleanor is not, in her own understanding, a woman dependent on a substance. She is a woman who found, in her darkest season, a medicine that helped her survive it, and who has simply never had reason to set it down since. Let me tell you about the objects themselves for a while now, because I think there is something worth lingering on in the physical world these women moved through. The actual weight and shape and texture of the things that carried this substance into their daily lives. The bottles were almost always made of a dark amber or brown glass, a deliberate choice that had nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with practicality, since the compounds inside degraded more slowly when kept from direct light. They were small, most of them sized to fit easily in a hand or a travelling case, sealed with a cork stopper rather than the metal caps that would come later, and often fitted with a small paper label bearing the chemist's name and address in careful copperplate print, along with the name of the preparation, and increasingly as the century wore on and regulations slowly tightened, the word poison in smaller type near the bottom, a word that Constance, Catherine, Eleanor, and countless women like them had long since stopped truly seeing, in the way a familiar warning on any object eventually fades into simple wallpaper. The spoons deserve their own moment too. Most households kept a particular spoon, sometimes silver, sometimes a smaller, specially marked medicine spoon with measurement lines etched into the bowl, reserved specifically for dosing out drops and tinctures with something approaching precision, though the precision available to a Victorian household, working by eye and by the rough graduations on a spoon, rather than any properly calibrated instrument, was considerably less exact than the word precision might suggest to modern ears. This imprecision matters more than it might seem to at first, because it meant that the difference between one woman's dose and another's, or even one night's dose and the next for the very same woman, could vary more than either of them realized, a small but genuine source of the kind of gradual, invisible drift we discussed earlier in the evening. Then there is the medicine cabinet itself, or the still room, or the simple locked drawer, wherever a given household chose to keep these things, and I think the choice to lock such items away common though far from universal across the households of this era, tells you something worth noticing. It was not, in the great majority of cases, a lock born of any suspicion about misuse. It was the same impulse that locked away the good silver or the fine china, a recognition that certain valuable, useful things deserved careful keeping, safe from careless servants or curious children, rather than any acknowledgement that the contents themselves might pose a particular danger to the household's own adult members. Constance's still-room cabinet, with its neat rows of bottles and tins, would have looked, to any visitor granted a glimpse inside it, like nothing more alarming than a well-organized domestic pharmacy, because that is precisely and sincerely what it was understood to be. I want to widen the frame just slightly here, because it would be incomplete to leave you with the impression that this story belonged only to the drawing rooms and dressing tables of London's fashionable squares, in the fen country of eastern England, in mill towns across Lancashire and Yorkshire. Opium in its various forms moved through working households too, often in even greater quantities relative to income, purchased not from a fashionable chemist with a bow-fronted window, but from a general shop or a market stall, sometimes even from a travelling seller passing through on market day. A servant girl working in a grand household like Constance's, exhausted after a day of physical labour that began well before dawn and rarely ended before 10 at night, might well have kept her own small remedy for her own aching back or her own restless sleep, purchased with her own modest wages, trusted in exactly the same unquestioning way her mistress trusted the finer preparations sitting behind the hairbrush upstairs. The substance did not respect the boundaries of class in the way so much else in Victorian society so carefully did. It moved freely through every level of that world, wearing slightly different labels, sold at slightly different prices, but chemically, fundamentally, the very same thing. Let me tell you what became of Sophia Bell, because I think her story, carried forward another decade, closes a particular loop worth closing properly. She married in 1878, a clergyman with a modest but comfortable living in a Somerset parish, and her monthly difficulty, along with her monthly remedy, simply travelled with her into a new household the way a piece of furniture might, unremarkable, unquestioned, folded seamlessly into the routines of her married life. Her husband, a gentle and rather bookish man, more interested in his sermons and his small collection of pressed wildflowers than in the particulars of his wife's medicine cabinet, never once inquired closely into what she kept in the drawer of her own dressing table, and Sophia never once felt any particular need to explain it to him. What changed for Sophia, gradually, over the years of her marriage, was the birth of her own children, 3 of them across the first decade, each pregnancy and each recovery bringing its own occasions for the same familiar bottle to reappear in a slightly expanded role. By the time her youngest was born in the mid-1880s, Sophia's relationship with laudanum had grown considerably beyond its original monthly purpose, into something closer to Catherine Price's daily maintenance, though Sophia herself, still only in her early 30s, would likely have found the comparison to a woman 20 years her senior somewhat startling if anyone had thought to draw it for her. She does not think of herself as unwell. She thinks of herself, when she thinks of it at all, as a busy mother of 3 managing the ordinary demands of a parish household with the help of a reliable, trusted remedy that has served her family faithfully since she herself was a girl of 15. I want to tell you about one more woman before we begin easing this evening toward its close, because I think her story rounds out the picture in a way none of the others quite manage on their own. Her name is Mrs. Frances Coleridge, no relation to the poet whose own well-documented relationship with opium looms so large over any discussion of this subject that I have deliberately avoided dwelling on it tonight, since his story belongs to a somewhat earlier generation and a somewhat different kind of telling than the one we are building here. Our Frances is a woman of considerable independent means, a widow twice over by the time we meet her in the early 1890s, in her early 60s, living alone but for her staff in a house in Cheltenham, a town particularly favoured by wealthy widows and retired families for its mild climate and its fashionable spa culture. Frances represents something we have not quite touched on yet tonight, which is the particular relationship between opium use and the broader fashionable health culture of resorts and spas that flourished across Britain in this period. Cheltenham, like Bath before it and Harrogate to the north, built its entire civic identity around the promise of restorative waters and gentle, health-giving routines, attracting a steady population of wealthy invalids and semi-invalids who structured their entire lives around a careful management of their constitutions. Frances takes the waters most mornings, a mildly mineral-tasting spring water believed, on grounds that modern medicine would find considerably less convincing than her own era did, to aid digestion and calm the nerves. She walks in the well-kept public gardens most afternoons, weather permitting, and she takes her dose of laudanum most evenings, a habit that has travelled with her through 2 marriages and 2 widowhoods, older by now than either of her husbands, outlasting them both in a life that has, by the standards available to her, been genuinely full and genuinely her own. The spa towns of this era developed their own particular social ecosystem, built almost entirely around gentle invalidism, and I think it is worth spending a little time inside that world before we move on, because it shows us something about how completely a certain kind of chronic, medicated existence had become not merely tolerated, but genuinely fashionable among a certain class of Victorian women. Frances belongs to a loose circle of similarly situated widows and unmarried older women who take breakfast together most mornings in the pump room, compare notes on their various physicians and their various remedies with the easy familiarity of women discussing dressmakers, and structure their days around a gentle, unhurried rhythm of walks, reading, correspondence and rest that would have seemed, to a woman like Margaret Whitfield, still raising small children on a clerk's income, almost unimaginably peaceful. Within this circle, laudanum use carries no stigma whatsoever, discussed as openly as one might discuss a preference for a particular brand of tea. One of Frances's regular breakfast companions, a Mrs. Ashby, mentions one morning that her own physician has recently suggested she try reducing her evening dose slightly, and the conversation that follows among the assembled ladies is notable mainly for its complete absence of alarm, a friendly, practical exchange of opinions about whether such a reduction is wise, whether Mrs. Ashby's constitution seems robust enough to manage it, whether the weather this particular autumn makes it a sensible time to attempt any change at all. Nobody in that pump room conversation treats the underlying question, whether a lifetime of daily opium use might itself be something worth examining more seriously, as a question requiring any particular urgency. It is simply one more small adjustment among the many small adjustments that make up a life lived carefully and comfortably into old age. I think what strikes me most, turning this scene over in my mind, is how thoroughly medicine and leisure and fashion had all folded into one another by this point in the century, indistinguishable threads in the same comfortable fabric. Taking the waters, walking in the gardens, dosing carefully with laudanum, dressing for dinner, corresponding with distant grandchildren, all of it belonged to the same unhurried, well-managed rhythm of a genteel later life, none of it marked out as separate or exceptional from the rest. Frances will live, in fact, to the considerable age of 79, dying peacefully in her sleep in the spring of 1908, having taken some form of opium preparation nearly every night for close to 50 years, a fact that her family, gathering for her funeral, would likely have found entirely unremarkable had anyone thought to mention it at all. By the time of Frances's death, the world around her medicine cabinet had begun changing in earnest, more quickly and more visibly than it had through most of the preceding decades. The Poisons and Pharmacy Act of 1908, passed the same year she died, tightened the rules governing the sale of opium preparations considerably further than the modest 1868 Act had managed, part of a broader shift in medical and public thinking that had been gathering real momentum since the 1890s, as physicians increasingly recognized and increasingly wrote about in terms a modern reader would find familiar, the genuine dangers of unregulated, unmonitored opium use across the general population. This growing awareness did not arrive all at once, and it did not, even by the early years of the 20th century, fully dismantle the deep, generations-old trust that women like Constance and Catherine and Frances had placed in their small brown bottles. But it marked unmistakably the beginning of the end of the era we have spent this evening inside, the slow closing of a chapter in which a substance we now understand with real clinical seriousness once sat, entirely unremarked upon, on a side table between a scent bottle and a family photograph. Let me bring you back, one final time, to Constance Ashworth, because I think her story deserves a proper closing before we let this whole evening settle into its quieter final hour. We last saw her in the autumn of 1867, 36 years old, 4 years into a habit she did not yet recognize as a habit at all. Let me carry you forward now, gently, through the following decades of her life, the way memory carries a person forward when they look back on their own years from a comfortable distance. Her children grew, as children do, the eldest son eventually following his father into the shipping business. Her daughters married respectably, one to a barrister and one, somewhat to the family's surprise, to a younger son of minor nobility who had taken an interest in agricultural improvement and carried her off to a comfortable estate in Hampshire. Constance's husband died in 1891, a heart complaint that took him relatively quickly after some years of declining health, and Constance, by then 60 years old, found herself for the first time in her adult life managing a household entirely on her own judgment, rather than in partnership with anyone else's. She managed it, by every account that survives of her later years, with exactly the same quiet competence she had always shown, and the small brown bottle, by this point an entirely unremarkable fixture of her daily routine for nearly 30 years, continued its place behind the hairbrush without interruption. The physician who attended her through these later decades, a different man again from Dr. Alderton, who had himself retired and passed away some years earlier, occasionally suggested, in the gentle way physicians of the era tended to raise such matters, that she might consider a gradual reduction in her evening dose, particularly as she moved into her 70s, and the ordinary frailties of advancing age made him somewhat more cautious about the substance's effects on a body no longer quite as robust as it had once been. Constance listened to these suggestions with polite attention, and on at least 2 occasions that her daughter later recalled, made a genuine attempt at reduction, only to find the resulting restlessness and discomfort more than she felt equal to managing at her age, and returned each time to her familiar dose without any great sense of failure or alarm attached to the attempt. She died in 1903, at the age of 72, of causes her family attributed, reasonably enough, to the ordinary decline of old age rather than to anything connected with the medicine she had taken faithfully for close to 4 decades. I think what I find myself sitting with, turning Constance's whole long life over in my mind, is how thoroughly ordinary it remained from beginning to end, how little drama or visible crisis ever attached itself to her particular story, and how that very ordinariness is, in its own quiet way, the most important thing tonight's story has to tell you. She was not a cautionary tale, she was not a tragedy in any conventional sense of that word. She was a capable, intelligent, well-loved woman who managed a large household, raised 3 children who by every account adored her, sat for decades on a charitable committee that did genuine good in the world, and who happened, alongside all of that, to carry a dependence on a substance that neither she nor anyone around her ever had adequate language to name. Both things were true of her at once, the competence and the dependence, existing side by side for the whole of her adult life, without either one ever fully cancelling out the other. Margaret Whitfield's later years took a somewhat different shape, and I think it is worth spending a little time with her too before we close, because her story reminds us that this whole picture was never uniform, never quite the same experience twice even among women living through broadly similar circumstances. Margaret's husband's career advanced steadily through the 1870s and 80s, and by the time we find her again in the mid-1890s, she has moved from the modest clerk's household of her younger years into a considerably more comfortable situation, her husband having risen to a partnership in his firm. Her own relationship with laudanum, which began that long-ago night with her teething infant, had by this point in her life settled into something occasional rather than daily, called upon for genuine crises, a bad headache, a difficult night, rather than woven into her routine the way it had become for Constance or Catherine. What made the difference for Margaret? If you were to ask her directly, and her granddaughter did in fact ask her something close to this question many years later, in the early years of the 20th century, was never any particular medical insight or warning that reached her before it reached the others. It was, by her own account, simply the ordinary business of a busy household, 3 more children after that difficult first winter, a husband whose rising position brought its own new demands on her time and attention, a life that filled itself with enough activity and enough genuine occupation that the quiet evenings which had once seemed to require a small dose to get through simply became fewer and further between. She never made any deliberate decision to reduce her reliance on the substance. Her life, in a sense, simply grew around it and past it, the way a tree grows around an old fence post until the post becomes almost incidental to the shape of the whole. I want to be honest with you that this was not the experience of every woman in tonight's story, and it was nowhere near the universal Victorian experience of opium use more broadly. Some women, and some men too, though their stories belong more properly to another evening, found themselves considerably less fortunate than Margaret in this regard, their use deepening rather than receding as the years passed, their households eventually forced to reckon, in ways that ranged from quietly difficult to genuinely painful, with a dependence that had grown too large to remain comfortably unremarked upon any longer. These stories exist in the historical record too, in the case notes of the physicians who were beginning, by the 1890s, to take the whole subject more seriously, in the occasional newspaper account of a household tragedy, in the private letters and diaries that survive from families who struggled, without much guidance or support, to help a mother or a wife or a daughter find her way back from a dependence that had become genuinely difficult to manage. This is a deliberate choice on my part, not to dwell tonight on the harder edges of those particular stories, not because they are not real or not worth telling, but because tonight is meant to be a gentle evening, and I think there is a way to be honest about history's full complexity without walking you through its darkest corners in the hour before sleep. What I can tell you, truthfully, is that for every family that struggled visibly with this substance, there were a great many more who lived out lives very much like Constance's or Frances's or Margaret's, quietly managed, quietly ordinary, the dependence present but never quite ascending into crisis, folded so completely into the fabric of daily life that it left barely a mark on the historical record at all, beyond the small brown bottles that occasionally survive, tucked into the backs of old dressing tables, waiting for some later generation to wonder what exactly they once held. Let us pause here, in this quieter stretch of the evening, and consider how differently we understand all of this now, not as a correction to anything we have discussed tonight, but simply as a way of holding the whole picture with a bit more perspective. Modern medicine understands addiction as a genuine physiological and psychological condition, deserving of care and treatment rather than judgment, an understanding built slowly and painfully over more than a century of research that the Victorian physicians we have met tonight simply did not have access to. We know now, in ways Dr. Alderton could not have known, precisely how opium interacts with particular receptors in the brain and nervous system, why tolerance develops the way it does, why withdrawal produces the particular constellation of symptoms it produces, why some people appear more vulnerable to dependence than others, for reasons that have very little to do with character or willpower, and a great deal to do with genuine biology. This knowledge did not exist for Constance, or for the physician who treated her, or for the chemist who sold her the bottle, or for the newspapers that advertised it to her in gentle, reassuring language. They were operating, all of them, with the best honest understanding available to their era, an understanding that told them, with real scientific confidence for its time, that this substance was safe when used sensibly, that a respectable woman managing her nerves with a small evening dose was doing nothing more alarming than a woman today taking a mild sleep aid or an anti-anxiety medication prescribed by her own trusted physician. I think that comparison is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is not entirely unfair. We are not, even now, so many generations removed from a world in which medicine and dependence sat closer together than we might like to imagine, and I suspect a good deal of humility is warranted whenever we look back at an earlier era's medical confidence and feel tempted to judge it too harshly from the comfort of our own considerably longer hindsight. What changed, over the decades following the years we have spent tonight inside, was not any single dramatic discovery, but a slow accumulation of careful observation, case by case, physician by physician, until the pattern that had been hiding in plain sight across so many respectable households finally became impossible to ignore. The regulations tightened, the medical understanding deepened, The soothing syrups for infants gradually disappeared from chemists' shelves, replaced eventually by preparations that did not carry the same risks Margaret unknowingly accepted on that long-ago night with her teething son. The small brown bottle, once as unremarkable as a scent bottle or a photograph frame, slowly became something requiring a prescription, then something requiring careful medical supervision, then something reserved, in the form we would recognize today, for genuine and carefully monitored medical necessity, rather than the casual, everyday remedy it had once been for so many ordinary Victorian lives. Let me take you through one more night now, a single ordinary evening, moving quietly between several of the households we have visited tonight, because I think there is something worth feeling in the simultaneity of it, the way these separate lives, unknown to one another, unfolded along such similar lines at the very same hour across the length and breadth of the country. It is somewhere in the middle years of the 1870s, a Tuesday in late October, the kind of evening when the fog settles early over London and the gas lamps along the streets seem to burn with a slightly softer, more diffuse light than they do on clearer nights. In Constance's house, the family has finished dinner, and she sits now in the drawing room with a book open on her lap, though she has read the same page twice without quite absorbing it, her mind still turning over a difficult conversation from her afternoon committee meeting. At 10:30 she rises, climbs the stairs, and goes through the familiar ritual at her dressing table, the drawer, the hairbrush moved aside, the spoon, the small bitter swallow that will, within the half hour, ease the tightness she has been carrying in her chest since that difficult meeting. Hannah comes in to help her undress, unlacing and unpinning with the practiced efficiency of long habit, and by 11 Constance is in bed, the room dark but for the last glow of the fire, her breathing already beginning to slow towards sleep. Some miles away, in the more modest house where Margaret Whitfield now lives with her growing family, a different kind of evening is unfolding. Her husband reads by the lamp in his study while she sits mending in the parlour, the sound of the needle pulling through cloth the only noise beyond the settling of the coals in the grate. Upstairs, her children sleep soundly tonight, no teething crisis this particular evening, and the small bottle on the shelf above the washstand sits untouched, waiting for whatever need might call on it next. Margaret goes up at 10, checks each small sleeping face in turn, the way she does every night regardless of whether anything requires her attention, and settles into her own bed beside her husband, with the particular contentment of a day that, for once, asked nothing extraordinary of her. In Bath, Sophia Bell, not yet married in this particular October, sits with her mother in the parlour working at a piece of embroidery she has been slowly finishing for months, in no particular hurry to complete it. There is no pain tonight, no need for the bottle in the linen cupboard, only the ordinary quiet companionship of a mother and daughter passing an evening together, the fire warm, the curtains drawn against the fog outside, a plate of biscuits between them that neither has quite finished. And in Cheltenham, though this particular scene properly belongs to a later decade than the one we are visiting tonight, I find myself imagining Frances Coleridge anyway, some 15 years before we actually meet her, still married to her first husband, still young enough that old age has not yet become the shape of her daily thoughts, sitting at her own dressing table in a house not so very different from Constance's, going through motions that will, decades later, have become as familiar to her as breathing. I want you to sit with this picture for a moment, all these separate rooms, all these separate women, none of them aware of one another, none of them imagining that their private, ordinary evening rituals formed part of a pattern being repeated, in slightly different forms, in tens of thousands of households across the country at that very same hour. There is something almost peaceful in that thought, strange as it might sound to say so, a whole nation settling into sleep, by whatever means each household had come to trust, the fires burning low, the gas lamps dimming, the fog thickening over streets that would by morning look exactly as they had the day before, and the day before that, each small bottle doing its quiet work behind closed doors that none of us looking back from this distance can fully see into, and none of us, I think, should feel we have any right to judge too harshly. There is one more part of this world I want to walk you through before we let the evening settle fully into its close, and that is the particular relationship between opium and simple, ordinary sleeplessness. separate from grief or pain or any of the other doorways we have already walked through tonight, because I think insomnia itself, plain and unadorned, deserves its own quiet moment in this story. It is, after all, a condition that connects the whole of tonight's audience to the women we have been visiting across all the intervening years and all the enormous changes in medical understanding between their world and yours. A woman named Mrs. Louisa Fenwick, the wife of a moderately successful wool merchant in Leeds, struggled with sleep for most of her adult life, for reasons that had nothing to do with grief or physical pain or the aftermath of childbirth, simply a mind that would not quiet itself once the household had gone still for the night, thoughts circling the same small worries, the accounts, the children's futures, a disagreement with a neighbour, round and round in the particular way that sleeplessness has of magnifying the ordinary into the unbearable somewhere around 1 in the morning. Her physician, consulted after months of complaints about exhaustion and a general dullness of spirit that Louisa herself attributed, reasonably enough, to simple tiredness, prescribed a modest dose of laudanum to be taken at bedtime, precisely the kind of straightforward, unremarkable treatment that thousands of physicians across the country were offering thousands of similarly sleepless patients in these same years. The relief, when it came, felt to Louisa like nothing short of a miracle after months of grinding fatigue. She slept, properly and deeply, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, and woke feeling something close to herself again, capable, clear-headed, able to manage her household and her children with an energy she had genuinely feared she had lost for good. It is not difficult to understand why a woman in Louisa's position, having experienced that particular relief after such a long stretch without it, would return to the same remedy night after night with real gratitude rather than any hesitation. The alternative, the sleepless nights and the exhausted days that had preceded it, felt considerably more frightening to her than any vague, unproven risk attached to the medicine that had so plainly, so effectively solved her problem. This is, I think, the emotional core of tonight's entire story, if I had to name just one thing at the center of it. Relief is a powerful teacher. When a substance reliably, consistently delivers a woman from genuine suffering, whether that suffering takes the shape of physical pain or grief or anxiety or simple exhausted sleeplessness, it earns a trust that is not irrational, not foolish, not a failure of judgment. It is trust built on real, repeated, lived experience, the most convincing kind of evidence available to any person managing their own life, without the benefit of a scientific understanding that would not fully mature for generations yet. Louisa was not wrong to trust her medicine. She simply did not yet have access to the fuller picture that later generations would slowly, carefully, painstakingly assemble, piece by piece, out of exactly this kind of story, repeated often enough, across enough households, for long enough, that the pattern finally became impossible to overlook. I want to spend a little more time now on a subject we have only touched lightly tonight, which is chronic physical pain, because it deserves fuller attention and because it introduces us to one more woman whose story I think rounds out this evening properly. Her name is Mrs. Judith Marsh, a woman we meet in Manchester in the early 1880s, 44 years old, married to a mill owner of moderate but genuine prosperity, a woman whose life was reshaped some years earlier by a fall from a carriage that left her with a persistent grinding pain in her lower back and hip, the kind of injury that modern medicine would investigate with considerable precision and modern physical therapy would address with real targeted treatment, but which Victorian medicine, for all its confidence in other areas, had genuinely limited tools to manage beyond rest, occasional strapping, and inevitably laudanum. Judith's pain never fully resolved. This is worth saying plainly, because it separates her story somewhat from the others we have visited tonight, most of whom found real, lasting relief from complaints that eventually eased on their own, grief that softened with time, monthly pain that came and went with predictable regularity, sleeplessness that resolved once whatever underlying worry had passed. Judith's injury simply did not heal the way her physician hoped it would, and so her relationship with her medicine took on a somewhat different character than Constance's or Sophia's, less a smoothing over of an occasional difficulty, and more a genuine ongoing management of a genuine ongoing physical reality that showed no particular sign of changing. Her physician, a careful and thoughtful man by the standards of his era, tried a number of alternatives over the years, various liniments and plasters, a period of rest that kept her largely confined to a couch for the better part of 2 months, even, at one point, a course of what was then called electrical treatment, a fashionable therapy involving mild currents applied to the affected area, which produced no lasting benefit that either of them could detect. Laudanum remained, through all of these attempts, the one reliable constant, the single treatment that consistently, dependably eased her pain enough to let her manage her household and her considerable social obligations as the wife of a prominent local manufacturer. I think Judith's story matters because it shows us something the others cannot quite show on their own, which is what happens when the underlying complaint that first brought a woman to this medicine simply never goes away. There is no version of Judith's life in which she might have gradually grown past her need for the bottle the way Margaret did, because the pain that first prompted her use remained a genuine daily physical reality for the whole of her remaining years. She lived to 71, dying in 1909, having taken laudanum in some regular form for close to 30 years. A woman whose family, looking back on her life after her death, remembered her as remarkably stoic, remarkably capable given her long-standing physical difficulties, never once connecting that stoicism and that capability to the small bottle that had made so much of it possible. There is a particular kind of quiet heroism in Judith's story that I find myself genuinely moved by, turning it over in my mind. A woman living with real, unresolved chronic pain for 3 decades, managing a household and a considerable social position throughout, using the one tool her era had given her that actually worked, and doing so with a dignity that nobody around her ever thought to name or acknowledge, because the whole arrangement seemed, to everyone including Judith herself, like nothing more than an ordinary woman managing an ordinary, unfortunate physical circumstance with the sensible, respectable medicine available to her. I think she deserves, all these years later, at least a moment of genuine recognition for that. Let me tell you a little more about the pharmacy culture of these decades, because I think there is a texture to it that rewards slower attention, and we have moved past it rather quickly earlier in the evening. By the 1870s, the trade of chemist and druggist had become a genuinely respectable profession in its own right, distinct from the older, more informal apothecary tradition that had preceded it, with its own training, its own professional body in the pharmaceutical society, and its own growing sense of scientific legitimacy that placed men like Mr. Sedgwick somewhere in the social order between a shopkeeper and a physician, respected for genuine expertise while still fundamentally engaged in trade. The chemist's shop of this era was a genuinely beautiful thing to walk into, and I think it is worth painting the picture properly. The counter itself, usually of dark polished wood, worn smooth by decades of hands and coins passing across it. Behind it, ranged along the walls, the glass-fronted cabinets holding row upon row of labelled jars and bottles, some containing genuine medicinal preparations, others the more decorative carboys of coloured liquid that had by this point become mostly ornamental, a visual signal of the trade's older, more mysterious apothecary roots, rather than anything with practical use. The air inside carried a particular smell that anyone who grew up near such a shop would likely remember for the rest of their life, a mixture of camphor and licorice, and something faintly medicinal underneath it all, not unpleasant exactly, but distinctive in a way that few other places in a Victorian town could match. Mr. Sedgwick himself, and men like him across the country, compounded a great many of their preparations by hand, right there behind the counter, weighing out ingredients on small brass scales with a precision that gave the whole process an air of genuine scientific seriousness, even when the underlying ingredients, laudanum among them, were considerably less carefully regulated than the careful weighing might suggest. A customer requesting laudanum would typically be asked how much she required, would watch it measured and poured into a small bottle taken from a shelf behind the counter, would pay her few pence, and would leave with no more ceremony or record-keeping than if she had purchased a bar of soap, at least in the years before the 1868 Pharmacy Act began requiring the poison book entries we mentioned earlier, and even after that act, the record-keeping remained, in practice, a fairly simple matter of a name and a date entered into a ledger that nobody outside the shop itself was ever likely to examine closely. The relationship between a chemist and his regular customers ran deep, built over years of exactly these small, repeated transactions, and that closeness, more than any doctor's occasional consultation, probably gave men like Mr. Sedgwick the clearest view of anyone in this whole story into the actual patterns of use unfolding across his town. He alone saw, transaction by transaction, exactly how often a given household returned for more, exactly how the quantities requested shifted over the years, and yet even he, with this uniquely intimate vantage point, rarely thought to draw the conclusions that later generations would draw so readily, because his entire professional training told him that what he was selling was safe, and the steady, repeated custom of his regular clients read, to his eyes, simply as loyalty to a trusted remedy rather than anything requiring concern. I want to bring one more household into tonight's story before we begin our final descent towards sleep, because there is an angle we have not yet properly explored, and that is the particular experience of pregnancy itself, separate from the recovery that follows it, which we touched on earlier through Constance's own difficult confinement. Let me introduce you to a woman named Mrs. Harriet Colby, 26 years old, expecting her first child in the autumn of 1879, living in a comfortable house in Edinburgh, with a husband who works as a solicitor and a mother-in-law who visits, in Harriet's private estimation, rather more often than is strictly necessary. Pregnancy, in this era, carried with it a particular category of anxious watchfulness that would likely feel familiar to any expectant mother across any period of history, layered on top of the very real medical dangers we discussed earlier, dangers that every woman of Harriet's era understood, at some level, hung over the months ahead of her regardless of how carefully she was cared for. Harriet suffers, through much of her pregnancy, from a nervous agitation her physician attributes to her naturally sensitive temperament combined with the ordinary anxieties of a first confinement, difficulty sleeping through much of the final months, a racing quality to her thoughts in the evenings that she finds genuinely distressing. Her physician prescribes a very small, carefully measured dose of laudanum for the worst of these evenings, considerably more cautious in his approach than he might be with a patient who was not carrying a child, aware, in the general terms available to his era's medical understanding, that whatever a mother took might in some fashion reach the child she carried, though the precise mechanisms of that transfer, and the particular risks it carried, remained considerably less well understood than they are today. He balances, as best his training allows him to, what he judges to be the genuine benefit of easing Harriet's evident distress against whatever caution seems warranted, and settles on a dose small enough, in his professional judgment, to bring relief without meaningful risk to the child. Harriet's daughter is born in November, healthy by every measure available to the attending physician and midwife, and Harriet herself recovers well, her earlier anxiety easing considerably now that the uncertain months of waiting have resolved into the concrete, manageable reality of a healthy newborn in her arms. She continues, for some months after the birth, to take a small evening dose as she recovers her strength and adjusts to the very real exhaustion of new motherhood, gradually reducing and eventually setting the practice aside entirely by the time her daughter is walking. One of the fortunate stories tonight in which the medicine served its purpose during a genuinely difficult season, and then, without any particular drama or struggle, simply stopped being needed. I think Harriet's story is worth including precisely because it did not end in dependence, because it reminds us, alongside all the other stories we have gathered tonight, that this substance's relationship to the women who used it was never a single fixed narrative running the same course every time. For some, like Constance and Catherine and Judith, the medicine became a permanent fixture of daily life. For others, like Margaret and Harriet, it served its purpose in a genuinely difficult season and then receded, leaving behind nothing more than an old habit occasionally remembered, a small brown bottle eventually emptied and not refilled, a chapter of a longer life that closed quietly and completely on its own. Let me take you through one last full day now, slower than any we have walked through yet tonight, because I want to close the factual portion of this evening the way we opened it, deep inside a single ordinary life rather than moving quickly between many. Let us return to Catherine Price's house on an ordinary Sunday in the winter of 1882, because Sunday, more than any other day of the Victorian week, reveals something about how thoroughly religious observance and domestic medicine sat alongside one another in a world that saw no particular tension between the two. Catherine wakes later than usual on Sundays, the household's routine relaxed somewhat in honour of the day, and takes her morning dose, as she has for years now, before dressing for church. The walk to morning service takes perhaps 15 minutes through streets considerably quieter than their weekday bustle, the family proceeding together in their good clothes, Mr. Price in his best coat, Catherine in a dress reserved specifically for this weekly occasion, her prayer book carried in a gloved hand. The service itself runs a comfortable hour and a quarter, familiar hymns, a sermon on some point of scripture that Catherine, if pressed, could probably summarize accurately, though she has heard variations of it many times before across many years in this same pew. There is something worth noticing in how Catherine's Sunday, built as it is around genuine religious devotion and genuine moral seriousness, unfolds with her laudanum dose as unremarked a part of its structure as her prayer book or her good gloves. The Victorian world did not experience any contradiction here, because the framework simply did not exist yet that would have suggested one. Medicine belonged to the body, faith belonged to the soul, and a respectable woman managing both with equal care and equal devotion was, by every standard available to her era, doing exactly what was expected of her, nothing more and nothing less. After church, the family returns home for a substantial midday dinner, the largest meal of the Sunday, roast meat and several vegetables and a pudding that the cook has been preparing since early morning, eaten together in a leisurely fashion that the ordinary weekday schedule rarely permits. The afternoon passes quietly, letters written, a walk taken if the weather allows it, and by evening Catherine finds herself, as she does most days regardless of what has come before, settling into the familiar rhythm that will carry her toward her evening dose and, eventually, towards sleep. There is a particular comfort in the predictability of it, a whole life organized around small, dependable rituals that ask very little of her beyond faithful, consistent repetition. I think this is, in the end, one of the truest things I can tell you about the world we have spent this evening inside. It was not, for most of the women we have met tonight, a world of visible crisis or dramatic suffering. It was a world of Sundays very much like this one, ordinary, comfortable, faithfully observed, quietly structured around a medicine that asked nothing of them beyond the same small ritual, morning and evening, that had become as natural to them as breathing. Whatever cost that medicine carried, and it carried real costs, several of which we have discussed honestly tonight, it also carried, for women like Catherine, a genuine and considerable measure of peace, purchased in the only currency her era knew how to offer, and spent faithfully every single day of a long, full, quietly ordinary life. Let me take you somewhere we have not yet been tonight, into the world of the servants who kept these households running, because their relationship to this substance, and to the women they served, deserves a fuller telling than the brief glimpse we had earlier through Hannah's locked cabinet key. Let me introduce you to a housekeeper named Mrs. Eliza Grant, though she has never married, the title being simply the customary courtesy extended to a woman in her position, who has run the domestic affairs of a large house in Bristol for nearly 20 years by the time we meet her in the late 1870s. Eliza's own relationship with laudanum began not through any physician's prescription, but through the older, more informal tradition of household remedy passed down through generations of women in service, a tradition considerably closer to folk medicine than the fashionable, doctor-supervised use we have spent most of tonight discussing. Her feet ache most evenings from a day spent almost entirely on them, moving between kitchen and pantry and the endless small errands a housekeeper's position demands, and she keeps her own small bottle, purchased with her own wages from a chemist near the servants' entrance rather than the grander shop her mistress patronizes, tucked into the corner of her small room under the eaves. There is a particular loneliness to Eliza's situation that I think deserves acknowledging, because it separates her story meaningfully from the women we have spent most of tonight with. She has no physician checking in on her twice a year, no family member likely to notice a gradual change in her habits, no social circle of similarly situated women comparing notes over afternoon tea. Her use of the substance exists almost entirely outside any observation at all. managed entirely by her own judgment, purchased entirely with her own modest means, understood entirely on her own terms. When her hands shake slightly some mornings before her first cup of tea, she attributes it, as she has always attributed it, simply to the cold and to age creeping up on her, never once connecting the tremor to the bottle in the corner of her room. I think Eliza's story matters because it reminds us that this whole picture we have built tonight, however thoroughly it touched the fashionable drawing rooms of London and Bath and Cheltenham, extended just as completely, if considerably less visibly, into the small attic rooms and modest lodgings of the women who served those households. The historical record preserves Constance's story more completely than Eliza's, not because Eliza's experience mattered less, but simply because the world that generated letters and diaries and physicians' case notes belonged overwhelmingly to women like Constance, while women like Eliza left behind, for the most part, only the faint traces that survive in household account books and the occasional passing mention in someone else's correspondence. There are the men in this story too, worth a moment's mention, because tonight is focused deliberately and almost entirely on women, and I think that focus is the right one for this particular evening, but it would be incomplete to leave you with the impression that opium's reach in Victorian Britain touched only the female half of the population. Men used these same preparations too, for their own headaches and their own chronic pains and their own nervous complaints, though the language surrounding male use tended to differ somewhat from the language applied to women, framed more often around the genuine physical demands of labour or the strains of professional life than around the vaguer, more contested territory of nerves and sensibility that so dominated the medical conversation around women's use. A barrister working long hours preparing a difficult case, a mill owner managing the endless pressures of a competitive trade, a clergyman exhausted by the demands of a large and needy parish, all of them might reach for the same small brown bottle that sat on Constance's dressing table, understood in slightly different terms but drawn from precisely the same source, sold by precisely the same chemists, carrying precisely the same risks that neither sex fully understood at the time. Let me walk you through the seasons of a single year in Constance's household now, because I think there is a particular comfort in watching a life move through its full cycle, and we have, until now, mostly visited single days or single evenings rather than the fuller rhythm of a year unfolding. Winter in the Ashworth house means fires lit in every room by 7 in the morning, the housemaids working through a punishing round of grates that must be cleaned and relaid daily, coal carried up multiple flights of stairs in heavy scuttles, the whole household organised substantially around the simple, exhausting business of staying warm. Constance's dose in these months comes a little earlier in the evening than in summer, the darkness pressing in by 4 in the afternoon, making the whole day feel, to her, considerably longer and more wearing than its actual hours would suggest. Spring brings a lightening to the household that goes beyond the simple lengthening of daylight. The social season proper begins in earnest by March, calling cards exchanged with renewed energy after the quieter winter months, invitations arriving with greater frequency, Constance's leather notebook filling with appointments in a hand that grows visibly more crowded as the weeks progress. There is a particular kind of anticipatory anxiety that arrives with this seasonal shift, the pressure of a social calendar filling faster than she can quite keep pace with, and her morning dose, in these months, often comes a little earlier than in the quieter winter, taken sometimes before breakfast rather than after. A small adjustment that neither she nor anyone around her thinks to read as significant. Summer, for a family of Constance's means, brings a partial escape from London altogether. Several weeks spent at a rented house near the coast, the sea air considered genuinely beneficial for the constitution by the medical thinking of the era, the children given considerably more freedom to run and play than the city allows them. Constance finds these weeks genuinely restorative, the pace of social obligations slowing considerably, long afternoons spent reading on a terrace overlooking water that catches the light in a way London's grey streets never quite manage. Even here, though, the small bottle travels with her, packed carefully among her other necessities, because the restfulness of a seaside holiday does nothing to address whatever underlying need her body has come to have for its steady, familiar presence. Autumn brings the return to London, the season we began this whole story inside, the particular melancholy of a house reopened after weeks away, dust sheets removed from furniture, fires relit, the rhythm of formal social life resuming its familiar shape. There is something almost musical in the way these seasons repeat themselves, year after year, the same essential pattern, recurring with only small variations, and I find something genuinely soothing in that repetition, the sense of a life organized around dependable, recurring rhythms rather than constant unpredictable change. Whatever else was true of Constance's relationship with her medicine, it existed within this larger, steadier rhythm of seasons turning, a life that, for all its private complexity, moved forward with a comforting, almost ceremonial regularity that carried her, year after year, through 4 decades of an existence that looked, from the outside, and very often from the inside too, remarkably whole. There is a particular kind of correspondence I want to tell you about now, because letters occupied an enormous portion of a Victorian lady's day, and I think the specific texture of that daily obligation, largely invisible to modern eyes, deserves its own attention before we close this evening. Constance writes, on an ordinary day, somewhere between 3 and 6 letters, a volume that would strike a modern reader as extraordinary, but which represented, in her world, simply the ordinary maintenance of a social network that stretched across the country, and in several cases, across the empire itself, cousins in India, a sister married to a clergyman in a remote Yorkshire parish, old-school friends scattered by marriage into households she may never physically visit again. The rules governing this correspondence were exacting in ways that modern letter writing has almost entirely forgotten. A letter of condolence required a response within a specific window, generally understood to be no more than a week, and needed to strike a particular tone, warm but not effusive, sympathetic but not intrusive, offering comfort without presuming a closeness the relationship might not fully support. A letter accepting or declining an invitation needed to be answered promptly, within days rather than weeks, the whole intricate machinery of Victorian social life depending on this kind of reliable, rapid correspondence to function smoothly. Constance sits most mornings at a small writing desk in her own private sitting room, a room considerably less grand than the drawing room where she receives callers, working through this correspondence with the same quiet, practiced competence she brings to everything else in her day. I mention all of this not because it connects directly to the medicine we have spent tonight discussing, but because I think it helps complete the picture of just how much genuine cognitive and emotional labour filled a day like Constance, labour that the surrounding culture insisted on treating as effortless, as simply what a lady naturally did rather than what she worked, continuously and skillfully, to accomplish. The letters had to be not merely correct, but genuinely well written, showing wit where wit was appropriate, warmth where warmth was called for, restraint where restraint served the relationship best, all of it composed in a hand that had been trained since childhood to a standard of elegance that took years to develop and constant practice to maintain. Her writing desk itself is a small, beautiful object, rosewood with brass fittings, a gift from her husband on an early anniversary, fitted with small compartments for paper, sealing wax, a supply of pens, and a bottle of ink that Hannah refills weekly from a larger supply kept downstairs. It sits near the window of her sitting room, positioned to catch the best of the morning light, and Constance has spent, over the 20 years of her marriage, thousands of hours at this particular desk, composing thousands of letters that maintained, letter by careful letter, the whole intricate web of relationships that gave her family its place in the world. There is something worth honouring in that patient, ongoing labour, invisible as it was to almost everyone who benefited from it, her husband included, who understood in only the vaguest terms just how much of his own social and professional success depended on the quiet, skillful correspondence his wife maintained on his behalf as much as her own. Let me tell you about the wardrobe now, because clothing occupied its own particular category of daily management in a house like Constance, and I think the sheer physical weight and complexity of it deserves a moment of proper, slow attention before we let this evening ease toward its final close. A woman of Constance's position changed her clothing several times over the course of an ordinary day. A morning dress worn for breakfast and household management, a walking dress or carriage dress for calls and errands undertaken outside the house, an afternoon dress for receiving callers or taking tea, and, on evenings when she dined out or received guests of her own, a full evening dress considerably more elaborate than anything worn earlier in the day. Each change required Hannah's assistance, the layers of a Victorian lady's dress simply not manageable alone, a chemise and drawers beneath, followed by a corset laced to a precision that took real skill to achieve without discomfort, followed by a crinoline or, in the later years of our story, the bustle that had by then replaced it, followed by petticoats, followed finally by the dress itself, which in its evening form might weigh as much as 15 pounds once fully assembled with its trimmings and its train. The whole process of dressing for an evening engagement could take the better part of an hour, Hannah working with the quiet, practiced efficiency of long habit, fastening what felt like an endless succession of hooks and eyes down the back of a bodice that Constance herself could never have managed alone. The financial weight of all of this matched its physical weight. Constance's clothing allowance, negotiated as part of her marriage settlement and reviewed periodically as her husband's fortunes improved, represented a genuinely significant portion of the household's annual expenditure, considerably more than most working families earned in a year, spent on silks and fine wools imported from across Europe, on the services of a dressmaker who visited monthly for fittings and consultations about the coming season's fashions, on gloves and shoes and the small accessories, a new fan, a set of hair combs, a length of ribbon in exactly the right shade, that a well-dressed woman of her position was expected to maintain without ever appearing to think too hard about the expense involved. I find myself genuinely struck, turning all of this over, by how much of Constance's daily existence involved managing enormous complexity while presenting an appearance of complete effortlessness, and I think this pattern connects, in its own quiet way, to everything else we have discussed tonight. The corset laced just so, the letters composed in a hand of practiced elegance, the dinner party planned to the smallest detail, the evening dose measured out with steady, unremarkable precision, all of it performed with the same quiet, invisible competence, all of it costing something real in time and attention and physical effort that the surrounding culture simply declined to acknowledge as labour at all. Perhaps this is why the small brown bottle found such comfortable purchase in households exactly like hers, offering, in its own modest way, a kind of relief from the accumulated weight of so much invisible, unacknowledged work. Let me tell you about one more household ritual before we move toward the final chapter of tonight's story, and that is the dinner party itself, because we have mentioned it in passing several times tonight without ever properly walking through what it actually demanded of a hostess like Constance. A dinner party of the kind she hosts perhaps twice a month, during the fashionable season, required planning that began in earnest at least 10 days in advance, invitations sent out with careful attention to the precise composition of guests, a balance of rank and interest and conversation that could make or ruin an evening depending on how skillfully it was managed. The menu itself needed to run to a specific number of courses, considerably more elaborate than an ordinary family dinner, soup followed by fish, followed by an entree, followed by a roast, followed by a sweet course, followed by a savoury, each course requiring its own wines, its own particular sequence of service, its own precise timing between the kitchen and the dining room, that depended entirely on the cook's skill and the butler's careful management of the whole production. Constance meets with her cook several days before each dinner to plan this sequence in detail, drawing on a small library of recipe books and the accumulated knowledge of years spent hosting exactly this kind of occasion, balancing what she knows her particular guests will enjoy against what will demonstrate, without ever seeming to try too hard, the genuine sophistication of her household. Seating, worked out with real care in the days before the event, followed its own rules of precedence, a system a hostess needed to know intimately, determining exactly who sat where relative to rank and title and the specific social dynamics of the particular evening, a wrong placement capable of causing genuine, lasting offence in a world where such things mattered enormously. Constance keeps a small card index of past seating arrangements, a private record that lets her track which guests have sat beside which others at previous dinners, avoiding both unwelcome repetition and any accidental pairing of guests who might not suit each other. On the evening itself, Constance's own preparation begins hours before her guests arrive. The elaborate dressing we discussed a moment ago, A final review of the table with its careful arrangement of flowers and silver and crystal, a last conference with the butler to confirm every detail is in place, and then, for perhaps 3 hours, she performs the role of hostess with a warmth and attentiveness that must appear entirely natural, guiding conversation, ensuring no guest feels neglected, managing any small awkwardness that arises with the smooth, invisible skill of someone who has spent 2 decades perfecting exactly this particular art. By the time the last guest departs, often well past midnight, Constance is genuinely, thoroughly exhausted, though nobody watching her graceful farewells at the door would ever guess at the effort the whole evening has cost her. It is perhaps not surprising, given everything we have discussed tonight, that these were often the evenings when her dose, taken once she finally reaches her own room, felt most necessary. The accumulated tension of hours spent in careful, continuous performance finally permitted to release. I think there is something worth naming plainly here, one final time, before we let this whole evening ease toward its close. The relief Constance felt was never imaginary, and the exhaustion that prompted her need for it was never imaginary either. Both were entirely real, woven together across decades of a life that asked, every single day, for more careful, invisible labor than almost anyone around her ever fully recognized. Let me tell you finally about the garden, because we have spent so much of tonight indoors, in dressing rooms and drawing rooms and consulting rooms, that I think it would be a shame to close without giving you at least one scene of open air and growing things. Behind Constance's house, past a small paved yard where the coal is delivered and the household's washing sometimes hangs on finer days, there is a modest walled garden, considerably smaller than the grand grounds you might picture attached to a country estate, but cared for with real devotion by an elderly gardener who comes twice weekly to tend it. Constance walks in this garden most mornings when the weather allows, a habit she picked up from her own mother and has never abandoned, valuing the quiet 15 or 20 minutes it gives her before the demands of the day fully arrive. In spring, the small beds along the walls fill with tulips and early roses, carefully chosen for colour and scent by a gardener who has worked this same small plot for going on 30 years and knows, better than Constance herself, exactly what will thrive against a London wall that receives only a few hours of direct sun each day. By midsummer, the garden holds a fuller richness, sweet peas climbing a trellis near the back wall, lavender that Hannah cuts periodically to freshen the linen cupboards upstairs, a small stone bench where Constance sometimes sits with a book she rarely manages to read more than a few pages of before some thought or worry pulls her attention elsewhere. There is a particular smell to this garden in early morning that I think deserves mentioning, damp earth and something green and growing, mixed faintly with the coal smoke that never entirely leaves London air, even in the pleasantest season. And beneath all of that, when the roses are in bloom, a sweetness that Constance has associated for her whole adult life with exactly this quiet quarter hour before her day properly begins. She does not take her medicine before this morning walk, generally waiting until she has returned indoors and settled at her writing desk, and there is something worth noticing in that small detail, how this particular pocket of her day, brief and private and entirely her own, requires no chemical assistance at all, sustained instead by nothing more than quiet air and the simple, undemanding company of growing things. I want to leave you with this image for a while, because I think it offers something the rest of tonight's story has not quite managed to offer on its own. A glimpse of Constance not as a woman defined by her dependence, but simply as a woman who loved, in an unremarkable everyday way, the particular quality of morning light falling across a small London garden, the smell of lavender crushed gently between 2 fingers, the quiet satisfaction of watching a rose she remembers as a small uncertain cutting, years ago now, climbing sturdily along a garden wall. Whatever else was true of her life, and we have discussed a great deal of what else was true of it tonight, this small daily pleasure remained entirely hers, untouched by anything we have spent this evening examining, a private, quiet joy that belonged to her alone, morning after morning, for the whole of her long and complicated life. There is one more figure I want to bring into tonight's story before we close, because I think her perspective completes something the others cannot quite reach on their own, and that is the perspective of a daughter watching her mother grow old. Constance's own daughter, the one who married the younger son with an interest in agricultural improvement and settled into a comfortable estate in Hampshire, kept a private journal through much of her adult life, portions of which survived among family papers passed down through later generations, and it is through fragments of that journal that we can glimpse Constance's later years through eyes considerably closer to her than any physician's occasional visit or any social acquaintance's passing observation. The daughter, whom we might call Louisa in honour of the name her mother nearly chose for her before settling on something else, writes with evident affection about visits home to see her ageing mother, describing Constance in her 70s as remarkably steady, remarkably composed, still managing her household with the same quiet competence she had shown for the whole of Louisa's childhood. There is a passage, dated sometime in the late 1890s, in which Louisa describes an evening spent with her mother by the fire, both of them working at needlework while rain fell steadily against the windows outside, a scene of real, uncomplicated domestic peace that Louisa clearly treasured enough to record in some detail. What strikes me most, reading these fragments, is how completely absent any concern about her mother's medicine remains from Louisa's private reflections, even in entries written well into a period when public awareness of opium's dangers had grown considerably more developed than it had been in Constance's younger years. Louisa had grown up, after all, entirely accustomed to her mother's evening ritual at the dressing table, had watched it for the whole of her childhood with the same unremarkable acceptance that Alice, Margaret Whitfield's daughter, brought to her own mother's remedy. Some inheritances passed down through a family not as objects or property, but as entirely unquestioned assumptions about what counts as ordinary, and Constance's relationship with her medicine belonged, for Louisa, firmly within that category of the unquestioned and unremarkable. There is a final entry, written shortly after Constance's death in 1903, in which Louisa reflects, with real and evident grief, on the particular quality of her mother's presence, her steadiness, her warmth, the way she had always seemed, to Louisa's eyes, entirely equal to whatever the day required of her. Louisa makes no connection in this entry, or in any other fragment that survives, between that remarkable steadiness and the small brown bottle that had sat behind her mother's hairbrush for the whole of Louisa's own remembered life. She simply describes with real tenderness a mother who managed everything, who carried everyone, who never once seemed to falter under whatever weight her considerable responsibilities placed upon her. I think there is something worth sitting with in that particular gap, the space between what Louisa saw and what we, with the benefit of considerably more knowledge than she had access to, can now understand about what made that steadiness possible. It is not a gap I want to fill with judgment, either of Constance for needing what she needed, or of Louisa for never quite seeing the fuller picture. It is simply a gap that existed, quietly, across an entire era, between the composed surface a woman like Constance presented to the people who loved her most, and the fuller, more complicated reality of what that composure actually required and actually cost. A gap that most families of this period, for all their genuine warmth and genuine closeness, never had quite the language or the framework to close. Before we let the story rest, let me take you back once more to the chemist's shop on that ordinary market town high street, because there is a final image from that shop I want to leave with you, one small transaction among the thousands that took place across the country on any given week of this long, quiet century. A young woman comes in near closing time, tired from a day's work in service at a house not unlike the ones we have visited tonight, and asks Mr. Sedgwick for a small bottle of laudanum for a headache that has plagued her since morning. He measures it out without a word of caution, wraps it carefully in paper, and takes her few pence with the same unhurried courtesy he extends to every customer who crosses his threshold. She thanks him, tucks the small parcel into her basket alongside a loaf of bread and a twist of tea, and steps back out into the gathering dusk, the gas lamps along the street just beginning to flicker to life one by one as the lamplighter makes his rounds. She has a walk of perhaps 20 minutes ahead of her before she reaches home, and as she walks, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening settle around her, a cart rattling over cobbles somewhere behind her, a dog barking at nothing in particular, the distant, comfortable murmur of a public house already filling with its evening custom, She thinks, as she walks, of nothing more dramatic than the relief that small bottle will bring her once she is home and able to measure out a dose, and of the plain, ordinary supper waiting for her, and of the bed she will fall gratefully into once the ache in her head has finally, mercifully eased. This is, in the end, the scale at which most of tonight's story actually lived, not in grand dramatic scenes, but in exactly this kind of small, forgettable transaction, repeated countless times across countless ordinary evenings, in countless towns whose names most of us will never learn, by women whose full stories will never be recovered from the quiet, undramatic lives they lived, and the equally quiet, undramatic deaths that eventually closed them. History remembers Constance and Catherine and the others we have spent tonight with only because their households happened to be wealthy enough and occasionally literary enough to leave behind letters and journals and physicians' notes that survived the passing decades. The young woman with her headache and her small wrapped parcel leaves no such record behind her at all, and yet her evening, in every essential way that matters, mirrors theirs completely. The same small bottle, the same quiet trust, the same ordinary hope for nothing more than a little relief before the next day begins its own demands all over again. I want to take you through the specific mechanics of the 1868 Pharmacy Act properly now, because we mentioned it earlier only in passing, and I think its story, small and bureaucratic as it might sound, actually tells us a great deal about how slowly and how reluctantly this whole world began to change. The Act arrived after years of quiet lobbying by the Pharmaceutical Society, a body of chemists who had spent decades trying to establish their trade as a genuine profession rather than a loosely regulated form of shopkeeping, and who saw in tighter control over substances like opium a way of raising their own professional standing alongside whatever public benefit the regulation might bring. The Act required that certain substances, opium and its various preparations chief among them, be sold only through registered pharmaceutical chemists, and that every sale be recorded in a poison book, a simple ledger noting the purchaser's name, the date, the quantity sold, and the purpose given for the purchase. It sounds, described this way, like a genuinely meaningful safeguard, and in some respects it was, at least in principle. In practice, the safeguard proved considerably thinner than its architects perhaps intended. A purchaser known personally to the chemist, as Constance was known to hers, as Catherine was known to hers, faced no meaningful obstacle at all beyond the minor inconvenience of having her name entered into a book that nobody outside the shop was ever likely to examine. The purpose given for a purchase could be as vague as for medicinal use, a phrase that satisfied the letter of the law while telling an outside observer nothing whatsoever about the actual pattern of use unfolding behind it. What the Act did accomplish, gradually and unevenly over the following decades, was a slow professionalization of the trade itself. Chemists increasingly trained to a more rigorous standard, increasingly conscious of their own responsibility as gatekeepers rather than simple merchants, increasingly likely by the 1880s and 90s to ask a genuine question or two of a customer whose purchasing patterns seemed to be shifting in a way that gave them pause. Mr. Sedgwick himself, by the later years of his career, had grown somewhat more attentive to exactly this kind of shift than he had been as a younger man starting out in his father's shop, not because any specific regulation compelled him to be, but because the slowly accumulating professional culture around him had begun, by degrees, to encourage a more careful, more clinically minded approach to his own daily transactions. It would take a further act, considerably more comprehensive, passed in 1908, to meaningfully tighten the whole framework, restricting sales still further, requiring a proper medical prescription for preparations that had, for the better part of a century, been available to any adult customer with a few pence and a plausible reason for wanting them. By the time this second act reached the statute books, the world we have spent tonight exploring had already begun, quietly and gradually, to recede into something closer to memory. A whole generation of women who had grown up trusting their small brown bottles now growing old alongside a medical establishment that increasingly viewed those same bottles with a caution their own physicians had never once thought to apply. Let me tell you about a particular medical debate that ran quietly through the professional journals of the 1870s and 80s, because I think it shows you something about how physicians themselves, Even the ones raising early concerns struggled to find the right language for what they were beginning to observe. A physician we might call Dr. Wilfred Sharp, practicing in Liverpool and publishing occasional papers in one of the period's more widely read medical journals, became, over the course of a decade or so, increasingly troubled by what he termed the opium habit among his female patients, a phrase that itself tells you something about the era's uncertain framework for the condition, neither quite disease nor quite failing, occupying an uneasy middle territory that nobody had yet fully mapped. Sharp's papers describe patients remarkably similar to the women we have spent tonight with, respectable, articulate, entirely functional in their daily lives, women who nonetheless displayed, on close and careful questioning, a pattern of use that had clearly outgrown its original medical purpose and settled into something closer to simple necessity. He noted, with genuine clinical curiosity, how difficult these patients found any suggestion of reduction, how readily their symptoms of nervous complaint returned the moment a dose was delayed or diminished, how thoroughly convinced they remained, even as he raised his concerns directly with them, that their medicine posed no danger whatsoever to their health or their character. What Sharp lacked, and what would take considerably longer for medical science to develop, was any real framework for treatment beyond the blunt instrument of gradual reduction, a process he acknowledged, with real honesty in his published accounts, produced genuine and considerable suffering in his patients, suffering severe enough that many of them abandoned the attempt partway through and returned to their previous, stable pattern of use, rather than continue enduring symptoms that felt, to them, considerably worse than whatever risk their physician was warning them against. He wrote, in one paper that survives in the historical record, of a patient who told him plainly that she would rather manage a lifetime of moderate, dependable use than endure even a single week of the withdrawal he was asking her to tolerate, a piece of reasoning he found himself, on reflection, genuinely unable to argue against with the tools available to him. I think Sharp's papers matter because they show us the very beginning of a more honest medical reckoning with this whole subject, tentative and incomplete as it remained, arriving decades before the fuller understanding we now take for granted. He did not have language for physical dependence in the precise clinical sense we use today. He did not have any of the pharmacological understanding that would eventually explain exactly why his patients' bodies resisted reduction so fiercely. What he had instead was careful observation, genuine curiosity, and an honest willingness to describe what he was actually seeing, rather than simply repeating the comfortable assumptions his own medical training had handed him. That kind of honest, patient observation, repeated by enough physicians across enough decades, is ultimately what built the fuller understanding that would eventually replace the world we have spent this whole evening exploring. Let me take you back once more to Cheltenham and to Francis Coleridge's circle of breakfast companions in the pump room, because there is another woman among that group I want to introduce properly, someone whose situation differs from Francis's own, in a way I think rounds out our understanding of that particular fashionable world. Her name is Mrs. Agnes Thornbury, a widow of considerably more modest means than Francis, the daughter of a country clergyman who married reasonably well but was left, on her husband's death, with an income sufficient for genteel comfort, rather than the fuller independence Francis herself enjoys. Agnes has come to Cheltenham not for any grand social season, but for what she describes, with the particular delicacy her circle favours, as her health, a phrase covering a genuine and long-standing difficulty with her digestion, alongside the nervous complaint that so often accompanied such difficulties in the medical thinking of the era. She takes the waters each morning with real, sincere hope that they will bring some lasting improvement, and takes her laudanum each evening with the calmer, more settled confidence of a woman who has long since stopped expecting any single remedy to solve everything, content instead with whatever incremental relief each part of her daily routine can offer. What strikes me about Agnes, turning her particular story over, is how thoroughly her modest income shaped her relationship with the whole apparatus of Victorian invalidism without meaningfully altering the substance at its centre. She stays in more modest lodgings than Francis, takes her meals with somewhat greater economy, cannot afford the private physician Francis consults, but relies instead on a doctor attached to one of the town's charitable dispensaries, arrangement common enough among genteel women of limited means who needed medical attention without quite the resources to command it privately. And yet her evening dose of laudanum comes from the very same kind of bottle, purchased from a very similar chemist, understood in exactly the same unremarkable terms as Francis's own considerably more expensive version of the identical daily ritual. This detail matters, I think, because it reminds us how thoroughly this substance crossed the boundaries that Victorian society worked so hard to maintain in nearly every other aspect of daily life. Class determined almost everything about how a woman like Agnes or Frances moved through her world, which streets she walked, which shops she patronised, which company she kept, which entertainments she could afford to attend. It determined almost nothing, though, about her access to laudanum, a substance cheap enough and available enough that it crossed every one of those careful, elaborate social boundaries with an ease nothing else in Victorian life quite managed. Agnes and Frances, separated by income and background in almost every other respect, met on genuinely equal terms in this one narrow particular corner of their shared world. Two women reaching each evening for the very same small brown bottle, trusting it with the very same unquestioning confidence, regardless of how differently the rest of their days had unfolded. Let me tell you about a particular kind of Victorian household object now, because we have mentioned the medicine chest only briefly tonight, and I think its full contents deserve a slower, more complete telling. A well-appointed household medicine chest of the 1870s, the kind Constance Stillroom held, and the kind a family like Margaret's kept on a more modest scale in a simple kitchen cupboard, typically contained a genuinely wide array of remedies beyond the laudanum we have focused on tonight, and understanding that wider array helps place our particular substance within its proper, fuller context. There was, almost universally, a bottle of sal volatile, the smelling salts we mentioned earlier, kept close at hand for the fainting spells that Victorian medical thinking associated so readily with women's supposedly delicate constitutions, spells that were, in fairness, often genuinely real, brought on by the combined pressures of tightly laced corsets restricting proper breathing, and rooms kept uncomfortably warm by the standards we would now consider healthy. There was quinine, essential for households in any region touched by the recurring fevers that still afflicted parts of the country, and camphor, used both as a mild stimulant and more commonly rubbed into the chest for coughs and congestion. There was chlorodyne, a proprietary mixture that combined laudanum with chloroform and a small amount of cannabis extract, marketed as a genuine cure-all for everything from diarrhea to insomnia to the common cold, and trusted by an enormous portion of the population precisely because it seemed to address so many different complaints with a single, reliable preparation. Most households also kept a supply of castor oil, considered essential for maintaining what the era called regularity, administered to adults and children alike, with a regularity of its own that modern parents would likely find alarming. There were various plasters and liniments for muscular complaints, a supply of bandaging linen, a set of cupping glasses in some of the more traditionally minded households, though these had grown considerably less common by the middle decades of the century, as medical fashion moved away from the older practice of bloodletting that cupping had originally served. And there was, in nearly every chest regardless of the family's particular circumstances, some form of opium preparation, whether laudanum itself, or Dover's powder, or one of the many soothing syrups marketed specifically for children, sitting alongside all these other remedies with no particular distinction drawn between it and any of its cabinet mates. I think this fuller inventory matters because it shows us how thoroughly medicated Victorian domestic life was in general, how readily this era reached for chemical intervention across an enormous range of ordinary complaints that a modern household might simply wait out or manage through considerably gentler means. Opium was not some singular, uniquely dangerous exception standing apart from an otherwise cautious medical culture. It was simply the most commonly reached for member of a whole family of remedies that Victorian households trusted with a confidence that strikes us now, from the considerable distance of more than a century of accumulated medical knowledge, as remarkably, almost bewilderingly complete. Let me tell you about one more woman tonight, someone whose story unfolds a little differently from the others, because I think it is worth showing you what happened when a family did, eventually, notice something had changed, and what the process of addressing it actually looked like within the limits of what their era understood. Her name is Mrs. Beatrice Wren, and she lives, in the years we are about to visit, in a comfortable house in York, married to a wine merchant whose business had prospered steadily through the 1870s and 80s. Beatrice's use of laudanum began in circumstances familiar to us by now, a difficult period following the death of an infant daughter in her early 30s, a loss that Victorian medicine treated, as we discussed earlier through Eleanor's story, as a legitimate occasion for medical intervention, alongside whatever spiritual or emotional comfort her family and church might offer. What differs in Beatrice's case is what happened roughly a decade later, when her eldest son, by then a young man training in his father's business, returned from several months spent in London and began, gently but persistently, raising questions about his mother's evening habits that nobody in the family had thought to raise before. He had encountered, during his time in London, a colleague whose own mother had struggled visibly and painfully with dependence on a similar remedy, a struggle that had ended badly enough to leave a lasting impression on everyone who witnessed it, and this experience had left him considerably more alert than his father or sisters to certain patterns he now recognized, with real unease in his own mother's daily routine. He noticed the particular way she grew restless if her evening dose was delayed by some interruption in the household schedule. He noticed how the amount kept in her private supply had grown over years he could dimly remember from his own childhood, from a modest quantity to something considerably larger. He noticed, most troublingly of all, a certain glassy quality to her manner in the hour or so after her dose, subtle enough that nobody who was not specifically looking for it would think to remark on it, but unmistakable once he had begun paying proper attention. The conversation he eventually had with his father, and the family's subsequent approach to Beatrice herself, unfolded with a delicacy that reflects the genuine difficulty of raising such a subject within a family culture that had never developed any comfortable language for it. They did not confront her directly, in the way a modern family might approach such a conversation, with considerably more clinical vocabulary and considerably more social permission to speak plainly about dependence. Instead, her husband arranged, gently and without explaining his full reasoning, a change of physician, choosing a younger doctor recently arrived in York who had trained under teachers more attentive to exactly this kind of concern than the older physician who had treated Beatrice for years. This new doctor, over a series of careful consultations that framed the whole matter as a general review of her health, rather than any specific alarm about her medicine, gradually worked with Beatrice toward a slow, patient reduction in her dose, extended over the better part of a year, rather than attempted all at once. None of it was easy, and I do not want to pretend otherwise. Beatrice experienced real discomfort through much of that year, restlessness and low spirits that her family attributed, in conversation among themselves, to the general strain of growing older rather than naming its actual cause even in their private discussions. But by the end of that careful, patient year, her dependence had genuinely eased, her use reduced to something closer to occasional rather than constant, a change that her son, watching from the considerable vantage point of his own greater awareness, understood as a genuine, hard-won achievement, even if his mother herself never fully grasped the full shape of what her family had quietly, carefully guided her through. I want to slow all the way down now, because we are moving into the final stretch of this long evening together, and I think this is exactly the right moment to let the pace ease into something closer to pure atmosphere, the kind of gentle, unhurried immersion that asks nothing more of you than to simply be here, resting, while the story continues quietly around you. Let me take you back into Constance house one final time, not for any particular event or revelation, but simply to sit with her in the ordinary quiet of a late evening, the way we began this whole story so many hours ago. The drawing room fire has burned down to a low, steady glow, the kind that no longer needs tending, throwing soft orange light across the pattern of the carpet and catching, here and there, on the polished surface of a side table or the gilt frame of a painting on the wall. Outside, the street has gone quiet in the particular way a London street goes quiet, well after midnight, the occasional distant sound of a cab passing several streets away, the low, steady murmur of the city that never fully stops but grows, at this hour, considerably gentler than its daytime self. Constance sits alone for a while before retiring, her needlework set aside, simply watching the fire settle, The particular stillness of this hour, a rare and genuine pleasure amid the ceaseless demand of her ordinary days. There is a particular quality to firelight at this hour that I think deserves its own attention, the way it moves, softly and irregularly, across a room otherwise settled into stillness, catching the edge of a picture frame one moment, fading into shadow the next, never quite the same from 1 minute to the following one. Constance has always found something genuinely soothing in watching it, a habit that predates her marriage, predates even her earliest use of the medicine we have spent so much of tonight discussing, a simple, uncomplicated pleasure that belongs entirely to her own private self rather than to any of the roles, wife, mother, hostess, committee member, that fill the rest of her considerable days. The clock on the mantel, a small ornate piece that was a wedding gift from her husband's mother, ticks quietly through the stillness, marking time in the unhurried way clocks seem to mark it best in the hours well past midnight, when nobody is watching them with any particular urgency. Constance will go up soon, will perform the small familiar ritual at her dressing table that we described so many hours ago at the beginning of this story, will settle into sleep in the same bed, beneath the same good linens, that has held her through 4 decades of nights very much like this one. But for now, for these few remaining quiet minutes, she simply sits, watching the fire, feeling the particular, hard-won piece of a day finally, fully finished, asking nothing more of her until morning brings its next round of small demands. I want you to borrow some of that stillness for yourself now, if you can, because I think it is exactly the kind of stillness this whole evening has been building toward. Whatever your own day has asked of you, whatever demands are still waiting somewhere at the edges of your thoughts, they can rest a little longer, the way Constance's needlework rests, set aside and forgotten for now, on the small table beside her chair. Let me carry you gently to a different house now, because I think there is comfort in visiting one more quiet evening before we let this whole story finally settle into its rest, and I want this particular scene to move slowly, without any new information demanding your attention, simply a place and an hour, and the particular texture of stillness that belongs to both. It is Margaret Whitfield's house, some years further along than the night we first met her pacing the nursery floor, her children grown considerably older now, the household running with the settled, comfortable rhythm of a family well established in its own particular routines. The kitchen, at this late hour, holds only the faint warmth of a range banked down for the night, the last of the day's cooking smells, bread and something savoury from supper, lingering faintly in the air alongside the cleaner scent of the soda Margaret's cook uses to scrub the deal table each evening before retiring. Upstairs, the house has gone fully quiet, each child settled into their own small room, the particular quality of a sleeping household that anyone who has ever lain awake in one will recognise immediately, a stillness that feels less like emptiness and more like a held breath, gentle and complete. Margaret herself sits for a while in her small private sitting room, considerably plainer than Constance's equivalent space but no less genuinely her own, working at a piece of mending by the light of a single lamp, the particular quiet satisfaction of a small, useful task performed at the end of a long day. She thinks, as she works, of nothing especially urgent, the ordinary drift of thought that comes at the close of an unremarkable day, a passing memory of something her youngest said at supper, a vague plan for tomorrow's marketing, the pleasant, undemanding company of her own unhurried mind. There is a particular sound to a house settling for the night that I find myself wanting to describe properly, the small creaks and settlings of old timber cooling after a day of warmth, the occasional soft pop of the fire in the next room, the distant, muffled sound of a dog somewhere on the street outside, barking once at something and then falling silent again. Margaret has grown, over her years in this house, deeply familiar with every one of these small sounds, familiar enough that she barely registers them consciously anymore, though she would notice immediately, I think, if any one of them were ever suddenly absent. By 11 she sets her mending aside, checks each sleeping child in turn the way she has done every single night for as long as she can remember, and settles into her own bed beside her husband, who is already deeply, peacefully asleep, his breathing slow and even in the darkness. She lies for a few minutes in the particular comfortable stillness of a body finally allowed to rest after a full day of ordinary, useful motion, and then, without any particular ceremony or ritual required, she too drifts towards sleep, carried there simply by the accumulated tiredness of an ordinary day well spent, needing nothing more than the darkness and the quiet and the familiar shape of her own bed to carry her the rest of the way. Let me tell you about the particular rhythm of an English winter Sunday now, a slower kind of day than any we have visited in detail tonight, because I think there is real comfort in the specific, unhurried texture of it. Snow rarely settled deeply in London through these decades, more often a grey slush that made the streets treacherous rather than beautiful. But in the years our story touches, the winter of 1881 brought a genuinely heavy fall that blanketed the whole city in a stillness even the usual traffic of carts and carriages could not fully disturb. Constance wakes that particular Sunday to a quality of light she always finds slightly strange, the peculiar brightness that comes from snow reflecting whatever grey daylight manages to filter through London's typically overcast winter sky, brighter somehow than an ordinary morning, despite the sun itself remaining entirely hidden. The household moves a little more slowly than usual, the housemaid's usual morning errands complicated by drifts against the area steps, the coal delivery delayed by a full hour as the merchant's cart struggles through streets considerably harder going than their ordinary cobbled surface. Church that morning is a quieter, more sparsely attended affair than usual, a good many families choosing to stay home rather than risk the walk, and the sermon itself runs shorter than customary, the vicar himself evidently eager to release his shivering congregation back to their own warm hearths. Constance and her family walk home carefully through streets muffled by snow in a way that makes even the ordinary sounds of the city, cartwheels, hooves, the calls of street vendors, arrive softened and distant, wrapped in a stillness that feels to her almost like a held breath across the whole city. The afternoon passes in the particular unhurried way a snowbound Sunday afternoon passes, the children permitted for once to build a small snowman in the walled garden we visited earlier tonight, their laughter carrying up through the windows in a way that makes Constance smile, despite the chill that has crept into even the well-heated rooms of the house. There is a particular pleasure in watching her children at play through a window, rather than joining them directly, the warm glass between her and the cold outside, a cup of tea going gently cold on the small table beside her chair as she watches. By evening, the fires burn a little higher than usual against the particular cold of a snow-bound night, and the whole household settles earlier than its ordinary custom, the day's small exertions against the weather leaving everyone genuinely, pleasantly tired well before the usual hour. Constance takes her evening dose as always, the small familiar ritual unchanged by the day's unusual weather, and climbs into a bed that Hannah has warmed with a stone bottle filled from the kitchen kettle. The particular luxury of real warmth against real cold making sleep on this particular night arrive more easily and more completely than on almost any other night of the whole long winter. There is a particular category of Victorian object I have not yet properly described tonight, and I think it deserves its moment before we let this evening finish its long, gentle descent, and that is the travelling case, because so much of what we have discussed tonight assumed a household fixed in one place. And I want to show you, briefly, what all of this looked like when a woman like Constance or Frances left home altogether. A lady's travelling case of this era, fitted and compact, held within its careful compartments a whole miniature version of her dressing table, small bottles for scent and cold cream, a folding hairbrush, a compact sewing kit for minor repairs undertaken on the road, and, tucked among these other necessities with no particular distinction drawn between them, a small supply of whatever medicine she relied upon at home. Frances Coleridge, in the years of her second widowhood, travelled more than most of the women we have met tonight, visiting a married daughter in Scotland most summers, occasionally venturing as far as the continent for a season, in one of the fashionable spa towns of Germany or France, that catered to exactly the same genteel invalid population Cheltenham served closer to home. Her travelling case, packed with real care before each journey, always included a sufficient supply of laudanum for the duration of her trip, calculated with the same practical precision she might apply to calculating how many changes of linen she would require. A simple, unremarkable item of luggage, rather than anything she thought to conceal or explain to the customs officials who occasionally inspected travelers' belongings at the various borders she crossed. This detail matters, I think, because it shows us how completely portable this whole world was, how thoroughly it travelled with these women wherever they went, never requiring them to plan around its absence the way a modern traveller might need to plan around finding a pharmacy in an unfamiliar city. The substance itself was legal or functionally unregulated across most of the countries these women might visit, sold in French and German pharmacies under names that varied slightly but referred to essentially the same preparation, understood with much the same casual, unremarkable trust that characterized its reception in Britain. I want to tell you about one particular journey Frances undertook in the summer of 1894, travelling by train and then by boat to visit her daughter in Edinburgh, a journey of the better part of 2 full days by the standards of travel available to her. She found train travel, on the whole, genuinely pleasant, the rhythmic motion of the carriage and the changing landscape passing the window offering a particular, restful kind of entertainment that she had come, over the years, to genuinely enjoy. Her evening dose, taken in her compartment as the train rattled north through darkening countryside, followed her exactly the same routine it followed at home, measured out with the same practiced hand, taken with the same unremarkable confidence, a small constant carried through an otherwise considerably varied and adventurous life. She arrived in Edinburgh the following afternoon, greeted warmly by her daughter and grandchildren, and settled into a visit that would stretch, as her visits generally did, across the better part of a full month, her travelling case unpacked and its contents arranged, once again, into a temporary version of the familiar dressing table ritual she maintained wherever she happened to find herself. There is something worth noticing, I think, in how completely this substance had become woven, not merely into these women's homes, but into their entire sense of themselves as capable, independent travellers, a small, quiet constant that asked nothing more of them than the same modest daily attention it required, whether they were in their own familiar bedroom or in a rented room several hundred miles from home. Let me tell you about the particular world of Victorian magazines and periodicals for a moment, because we discussed advertising briefly earlier tonight, and I think there is a fuller texture to that world worth spending a little more time inside. A household like Constance's typically subscribed to several publications, a general interest magazine aimed at the whole family, a more specifically feminine periodical filled with fashion plates and household advice, and often a religious publication reflecting whatever particular denomination the family favoured, each of them arriving weekly or monthly, read and discussed and eventually passed along to friends or relations with less means to subscribe themselves. The advertisements scattered through these publications occupied a particular, comfortable place in a reader's experience, considerably less separated from the editorial content than modern advertising tends to be, often written in a similarly warm, conversational tone that made the whole publication feel like a single continuous conversation rather than distinct articles interrupted by commercial interruption. An advertisement for a soothing syrup might sit directly beside a genuinely useful article on household economy, both delivered in much the same reassuring, authoritative voice, both trusted by readers like Constance, with much the same unquestioning confidence. I want to describe one particular advertisement that ran in various forms across a number of these publications through the 1870s, because I think its specific language tells you something worth hearing. It promised, in the gentle, almost lyrical prose favoured by the era's advertising copywriters, peaceful rest for the overwrought nerves of the modern lady, restoring, in its own words, the natural composure that the demands of contemporary life had so cruelly disturbed. It featured a small illustration, in the style common to the period, of a woman reclining gracefully in a well-appointed drawing room, her expression serene, a small bottle visible on the table beside her, positioned with the same casual respectability as the vase of flowers beside it. Readers encountering this advertisement, women like Constance flipping through her magazine in a quiet hour before dinner, experienced it not as a commercial pitch demanding skepticism, but as a genuine sympathetic acknowledgement of a difficulty they recognized intimately in their own lives, the accumulated strain of managing households and social obligations and family demands, with a composure the whole surrounding culture insisted must never visibly falter. The advertisement offered, in its gentle, reassuring language, exactly what these women had been taught to want: relief without weakness, calm without complaint, a solution that asked nothing more difficult of them than a small daily dose of something readily available at any respectable chemist's shop. I think there is something genuinely worth naming here, one final time, about how thoroughly this whole commercial apparatus understood and catered to the particular emotional needs of Victorian womanhood, offering through the comfortable medium of a familiar magazine page exactly the kind of validation and relief that the culture's rigid expectations around composure and performance made so difficult to find anywhere else. The advertisement was not lying, not exactly, not by the honest standards of what its writers themselves believed about the product they were selling. It was simply speaking, with real fluency, the particular emotional language of an era that had built an entire elaborate architecture of expectation around women like Constance, and had then handed them, through exactly this kind of gentle, reassuring advertisement, one of the only tools available for managing the weight of it. Let me bring the story back one more time to the pump room in Cheltenham, because there is a particular ritual there I have not yet described properly, and I think it deserves its place among tonight's many small, comfortable scenes before we finally let everything settle. The pump room itself, a grand, high-ceilinged hall built specifically for the taking of the waters, opens early each morning, well before most fashionable visitors would ordinarily rise, because the waters were understood to work best when taken on an empty stomach, a belief that shaped the whole rhythm of a spa town's social calendar around this single early appointment. Frances arrives most mornings by 7:30, considerably earlier than her ordinary habits at home would incline her toward, dressed in a walking costume suited to the modest exertion of the short journey from her lodgings, and takes her place among the small crowd of similarly early risen invalids gathered around the central pump, where an attendant fills glass after glass with water drawn directly from the spring below the building. The water itself carries a faintly metallic, mineral taste that Frances has never particularly enjoyed, though she has, over years of visiting, come to associate that specific unpleasant flavour with the beginning of her day so thoroughly that its absence, on the rare mornings she skips the ritual, leaves her feeling faintly incomplete. The conversation among the gathered invalids follows its own comfortable, established patterns, comparisons of how each has slept, gentle inquiries after various ongoing complaints, occasional recommendations passed between friends regarding a particular physician or a particular remedy that has proven helpful. It was in exactly this kind of morning conversation that Mrs. Ashby first mentioned, as we discussed earlier, her physician's suggestion that she reduce her evening dose, and it is in this same setting, some weeks later, that Frances learns how that particular experiment concluded, Mrs. Ashby reporting, with the same easy candour she brings to every other subject, that the reduction had proven more uncomfortable than she felt equal to sustaining, and that she had, after a fortnight's genuine effort, returned to her previous familiar amount. Nobody in the small gathered circle treats this outcome as any particular failure on Mrs. Ashby's part. It is discussed instead with the same practical, sympathetic tone the group brings to any other minor setback in the ongoing project of managing one's health and comfort into old age, a project every person gathered around that pump understands intimately from their own considerable experience. Frances offers her own quiet sympathy, having attempted a similar reduction herself some years earlier with much the same result, and the conversation moves easily on to other matters, the previous evening's concert in the assembly rooms, a letter one of the ladies has received from a grandchild recently settled in India, the particular quality of that morning's unusually mild weather. I find something genuinely touching in the easy, unjudging quality of this small community, women who have found, in each other's company, a particular kind of understanding that their families at home, however loving, could not quite offer in the same way, a shared, lived familiarity with the whole complicated business of managing bodies and nerves that had by this stage of their lives grown considerably more demanding than any of them had anticipated in their younger years. Whatever else this pump room circle represented, it offered its members something genuinely valuable, a place where the ordinary difficulties of aging and dependence could be discussed plainly, without shame, among people who understood exactly what such difficulties actually involved. Let me take you through one final ordinary night before we let this whole long evening ease all the way into its close. A night that belongs to no single household in particular, but rather to the whole quiet country we have spent tonight moving through, because I think there is something genuinely worth feeling in that wider collective stillness before we finish. Picture the whole of Britain as the 1870s give way slowly toward the 1880s, settling into its ordinary nighttime rhythm across thousands of towns and villages and city streets, gas lamps burning low, fires banked for the night, households large and small drawing their curtains against whatever weather the particular evening has brought. In grand houses like Constance, small brown bottles sit on dressing tables behind ivory hairbrushes, measured out with the same practiced, unremarkable precision we have described so many times tonight. In more modest households like Margaret's, the same small bottles wait on kitchen shelves or in bedroom cupboards, ready for whatever need the night might bring. A restless child, a difficult headache, the ordinary insomnia that visits any household from time to time regardless of its means. In servants' quarters and attic rooms, in the small rented lodgings of women like Agnes Thornbury, in the modest cottages of the fen country where the old association between opium and the damp, fever-prone landscape ran deepest of all, the same substance, in one preparation or another, waits at the ready, trusted with the same broad, unquestioning confidence that spans every level of this whole complicated, hierarchical society. I think what strikes me most, holding this wide collective image in my mind, is how completely ordinary the whole arrangement felt from the inside. How little any of these separate households, going about their separate evenings, understood themselves to be part of anything resembling a pattern at all. Each woman reaching for her own small bottle experienced the moment as entirely private, entirely personal, a simple, sensible response to whatever particular difficulty her own day had brought her. None of them could see, the way we can see now from the considerable distance of more than a century, the full shape of what all these separate private moments added up to across the whole breadth of the country, a shared national habit so thoroughly normalized that it left almost no visible trace in the ordinary texture of daily conversation, discussed with no more weight or concern than the weather or the state of the roads. This is, I think, the final thing I want you to carry with you from tonight's long story, more than any single fact or figure we have discussed. History is very often made not from dramatic, singular decisions, but from exactly this kind of accumulated, unremarkable repetition, millions of small private choices made independently by people who never once thought of themselves as part of any larger movement, adding up, gradually and invisibly, into something that later generations would eventually need to name, to study, to regulate, to understand in ways that none of the people actually living through it ever had the chance to. Constance and Margaret and Catherine and all the others we have spent this evening with were not making history in any grand, deliberate sense. They were simply getting through their days and then their nights, the best way their world had taught them how, one small measured dose at a time, one quiet evening after another, for the whole long ordinary span of lives that mattered enormously to the people who lived them, whatever else we might now understand about the particular substance so many of them carried quietly, faithfully at their side. There is one final household detail I want to leave you with before we let the story finally rest, something small and specific that I think captures, better than any broader summary could, the particular quality of this whole world we have spent the evening inside. It concerns a simple wooden box that sat for the better part of 40 years on a shelf in the still room of Constance's house, a plain, unremarkable container in which Hannah, and later the maid who succeeded her, kept the small collection of spoons, droppers, and measuring glasses used across the household's whole range of domestic remedies. The box itself was nothing special, pine rather than any finer wood, its corners worn smooth by decades of hands opening and closing its simple hinged lid. Inside, arranged with the particular tidiness that good household management demanded, sat perhaps a dozen small implements, each with its own particular purpose, a silver spoon reserved specifically for Constance's own evening dose, a smaller pewter one used for the children's occasional remedies in their younger years, a glass dropper for the more precisely measured tinctures that certain complaints required. Every one of these small objects had been touched, thousands of times over, by hands managing the ordinary business of keeping a large household healthy and functional, and every one of them carried, in its own small way, some quiet fragment of the story we have spent tonight exploring. When Constance died in 1903, her daughter Louisa, clearing the house alongside her siblings in the weeks that followed, found this small box exactly where it had always sat, and kept it, for reasons she never fully articulated even in her own private journal, rather than discarding it along with so much of the household's other ordinary domestic equipment. It passed, eventually, into a trunk of family keepsakes that travelled down through subsequent generations, forgotten for long stretches, rediscovered occasionally by some descendant curious about a family history that had by then receded into the comfortable distance of old photographs and half-remembered stories. I think there is something worth sitting with in how an object this small, this genuinely unremarkable, could carry within it such a complete and quiet record of an entire vanished way of life, the whole elaborate world of Victorian domestic medicine folded invisibly into a plain pine box that most people encountering it today would walk past without a second glance. That is, in many ways, exactly how this whole story lived and passed, quietly, without fanfare, in objects and rituals so completely ordinary that nobody thought to mark them as significant while they were actually happening. It took the considerable distance of a century and more, and the patient work of historians, piecing together fragments of letters and account books and surviving journals, to reconstruct what these small, unremarkable objects actually meant to the women who used them every single day of their long, complicated, entirely ordinary lives. And now, having spent this whole long evening together inside that vanished world, I think it is finally time to let it rest, the way everyone within it eventually rested too. The fires burned down to their last quiet embers, the small bottles and spoons put away for the night, the whole vast, invisible pattern of a nation's ordinary evenings finally, gently, complete. Let me tell you about one more small ritual before the evening finally rests, because I think it belongs among the quiet objects and habits we have spent so long with tonight. In many of these households, a particular calendar hung near the kitchen door or inside a linen cupboard, marked not with appointments or social obligations, but with the household's own private rhythm of remedies, when the cough syrup had last been refreshed, when the coal delivery was due, when a particular child's teething troubles had first begun, and roughly how long, by the housekeeper's careful memory, such troubles tended to last before easing on their own. It was a modest, practical document, kept by whichever woman managed the household's daily affairs, and it recorded, without any of the drama we might now attach to such details, the steady, unremarkable rhythm of an ordinary life lived alongside these ordinary medicines. Constance's own housekeeper kept just such a record for years, a small ledger noting the household's various remedies and their replenishment, laudanum among them, entered with the same plain, business-like hand used for candles and soap and coal. It survives, in fragments, among the family papers passed down through later generations, a quiet, undramatic witness to exactly the kind of life we have spent this whole evening exploring together, ordinary, careful, entirely unremarkable in its own time, and yet, from the distance of more than a century, genuinely worth understanding for everything it can still tell us about how completely a whole world once organized itself around a bottle nobody thought twice about. I think that is where I want to leave you, in this last quiet moment before sleep, holding the whole gentle weight of everything we have walked through together tonight, without any need to resolve it into a single tidy lesson. The small brown bottle belonged to its own particular century, trusted completely by people doing the very best they could with the understanding available to them. And tonight, in this different century entirely, you need nothing more than your own tired, ready body and the quiet of wherever you are lying right now. There is one last small image I want to leave with you before we close, because I think it captures something true about the whole evening we have spent together. Somewhere, on a shelf that no longer exists in a house that has long since been rebuilt into something else entirely, a small brown bottle once sat, catching whatever light came through a window at a particular hour of a particular afternoon, holding within it nothing more remarkable than what an entire century had agreed, quietly and without much question, to trust. I want to close this evening the way I think it deserves to be closed, not with a tidy moral or a stern warning, but simply by letting you sit for a little while longer inside the quiet world we have spent these hours building together. There is no single lesson I want to hand you before you drift off. No neat conclusion that wraps up everything we have discussed into something small enough to carry away in your pocket. History rarely offers that kind of tidiness, and I think it would be dishonest of me to pretend otherwise tonight. What I can offer you instead is this. Somewhere in a house that no longer stands, on a street that has long since been rebuilt into something a Victorian eye would not recognize, a woman named Constance once sat at a dressing table very much like the one you might have in your own home right now, and reached for something that helped her carry a life that asked a very great deal of her. She was not weak for needing that help. She was not foolish for trusting it. She was simply a person, living inside the understanding available to her time, doing the best she could with the tools her world had placed within her reach. That is, in the end, all any of us are ever really doing, in whatever era we happen to find ourselves living through. The fires in all these houses have gone out now. The fog outside has thickened into full night. Hannah has banked the coals in Constance's grate and gone up to her own small room under the eaves. Margaret's children sleep on undisturbed, their small bottle of remedy waiting quietly on its shelf for whatever night might eventually call on it again. Sophia's embroidery sits folded and set aside until tomorrow. Eleanor, remarried and settled, sleeps beside a husband who has never once thought to ask what exactly helps her rest so easily most nights, because there has never been any reason for him to wonder. Catherine's small brown bottle sits on her own bedside table now, rather than downstairs in the drawing room, close at hand for whatever hour of the night might need it. And somewhere in a Cheltenham that does not yet quite exist in the year we have mostly been visiting tonight, a young Frances Coleridge sleeps peacefully beside her first husband, decades away still from the long, comfortable widowhood that awaits her. All of them, in their own separate rooms, in their own separate corners of a country that has long since moved on from the world they knew, are simply asleep. Ordinary, unremarkable, peaceful sleep, purchased in each case by whatever means their era made available to them, resting now the way you are resting, in a bed that feels, for this particular hour, like the safest and most comfortable place in the whole world. I think there is something worth holding on to in that image as you let yourself drift, the sheer quiet ordinariness of it, generation after generation of tired people finding whatever help they could to close out a difficult day and begin again tomorrow. You do not need a small brown bottle tonight. You have made it this far on nothing but your own tiredness and whatever quiet comfort this story has managed to offer you, and I think that is a genuinely good thing to notice about yourself before you go. The blanket is heavy around your shoulders. The room has gone soft and dim the way you left it at the start of this story. Whatever difficult meeting or difficult day is waiting for you tomorrow, it can wait a little longer still. Right now, there is nothing you need to manage, nothing you need to perform, nowhere you need to be composed for anyone but yourself. Let your breathing slow the way Constance did, the way Margaret's did, the way every tired woman in every quiet room across that long, fog-softened century eventually let hers slow too. The story is finished now, the house is dark, everyone in it is asleep, and so, I think, very nearly are you. Sleep well, friend. I will be here again next time, whenever you need somewhere quiet to land. Good night.